Picture yourself walking beneath stone archways in the quiet courtyard of an ancient castle. Notice the way the evening light spills like honey across weathered stone, and the soft brush of linen sleeves against your skin. Allow this moment to dissolve into something distant and strangely heavy, like the echo of a forgotten crown. Tonight, our story will drift along the quiet corridors of medieval royalty, where the title of queen promised splendor, but delivered confinement, sorrow, and isolation. There are no grand triumphs to chase here, no urgent mysteries to solve. Simply let this gentle tale become a slow-moving current, guiding your thoughts toward stillness and sleep. If this gentle journey brings you comfort, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. I always love to see where in the world you listen, and the hour at which you drift off. Share your peaceful place in the comments below if you wish. It is early morning and the cold breath of the castle stones has not yet retreated. The fire in the hearth has long since faded to embers, and the only warmth lies beneath the thick woolen blankets covering the queen's bed. Outside, the world is silent, save for the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance and the restless creak of wind against the wooden shutters. She awakens not to the sound of birdsong, but to the soft footfalls of her maidservant. Entering the chamber, the girl does not speak. She merely moves quietly, expertly, with the routine precision that comes from a life of serving someone whose days are dictated by custom, ritual, and expectation. The shutters are pulled back. Pale, blue-tinged light spills onto the stone floor. Another day has begun. The queen is not alone for long. Within moments, more attendants arrive. Ladies in waiting with careful hands and measured words. A personal confessor murmuring a prayer under his breath, and a silent pair of servants carrying the linen for her dressing. Privacy is not a luxury granted to queens. Her body, her time, even her expressions, everything belongs to the role, and the role belongs to the crown. She sits up slowly. Her bones ache from the damp, though she will never speak of it aloud. The chamber remains cold even in summer, built not for comfort but for grandeur. Around her, the walls are decorated with faded tapestries that tell stories of saints and battles long past. A large wooden chest at the foot of her bed holds garments selected not for preference but for propriety. Today, her gown will be green. She does not remember if she requested it, or if the decision was made for her. Dressing is a slow, deliberate act. First, the linen shift, softened over time by repeated washing. Then the tighter-fitting kirtle, its laces tugged and adjusted until it shapes her waist to the desired silhouette. Over this, layers of embroidered fabric, each heavy with thread, pearls, and meaning. A girdle encrusted with semi-precious stones circles her waist. More ornamental than practical, her veil is pinned precisely, her wimple carefully adjusted beneath the chin. Every fold, every ribbon, every inch of fabric speaks to status, devotion, and discipline. Before food there is prayer. She kneels on a cushion at the foot of a small wooden altar near her bedside. A candle flickers beside an icon of the Virgin, and the scent of dried lavender hangs in the air. Her prayer is not hurried. It is measured, solemn. She prays for strength, for guidance, for peace within the court, and a child in her womb. She crosses herself and remains still for a moment longer before rising. The queen's faith must be visible, calm, consistent, unquestioning. Breakfast is taken alone. Her husband, the king, is already at the stables or in council with his knights. She does not ask. A platter is laid before her. Thick slices of coarse bread, soft cheese, figs soaked in wine, and a spiced ale served warm in a carved wooden cup. A servant nearby samples a portion from each dish before she may touch it. Poison is not a distant fear. It is a quiet possibility in every royal household. The meal is light, but she eats slowly. She does not speak unless spoken to. Her thoughts wander to her mother's distant estate, to the letter she received last week from her sister in Aquitaine, to the quiet pressure in her abdomen that may or may not be the sign of something stirring within. After breakfast comes the gathering. In the solar, where the sun filters weakly through stained glass windows, the Queen's ladies assemble. They sit with embroidery hoops in their laps, fingers busy with silks and golden threads. They speak of minor court gossip, who wore what at last week's feast, which cousin has taken ill, whose child has begun to speak Latin. Their voices are hushed, polite, but never idle. Every comment is weighed, every silence observed. The Queen listens more than she contributes. The embroidery itself is a kind of ceremony. The queens of old stitched their prayers into altar cloths, their grief into mourning banners. The needle passes through the fabric again and again, rhythmic, almost meditative. Today, they work on a panel for the chapel, a scene of Saint Margaret slaying a dragon. The Queen sews the dragon's wing. She wonders how many queens before her have embroidered the same saint into the same kind of linen for the same kind of light. By mid-morning, she retreats to her private chamber, a smaller, more intimate room tucked between the chapel and her main bedchamber. A fire is lit, and the smell of sweet herbs rises from a small brass bowl placed on the coals. A clerk enters and reads aloud a letter sent from a neighboring noblewoman. It is filled with pleasantries and thinly veiled requests, land disputes, inheritance concerns, a rumor about a squire and a merchant's daughter. The Queen nods occasionally, but she writes no reply. That will be done by her secretary later in her name, with carefully chosen words she will likely never read. From the window, she watches the castle courtyard. A stable hand struggles to calm a nervous gelding. A washerwoman hauls steaming linens up stone stairs. A group of squires practice swordplay, their wooden blades clattering loudly against each other. It all looks alive in a way her life no longer feels. She has not walked outside the castle walls in weeks. The last time she rode, it was side saddle, down a manicured path to bless a new chapel. Even the peasants had been cleaned up for the occasion. The hours passed slowly, filled with appearances. A visit from the steward, a blessing from the abbot Dot, a short recital by a traveling harpist who plays too fast. At each event, she must smile. Her eyes must soften at the correct moment. Her voice must remain steady, gentle, feminine. Queens do not raise their voices. They do not frown. They do not yawn, no matter how heavy their eyes grow. In the late afternoon, she receives her physician. He checks her pulse, examines her eyes, and presses gently on her abdomen. He mutters something about balance, about humors, about her need to drink more warm milk mixed with saffron. She nods and thanks him. He bows and leaves. No one asks how she feels. That evening, there will be a formal supper. She will sit beside the king and speak only when addressed. There will be music, perhaps a jester. A noble from the north has arrived and must be made welcome. She has not seen her children since yesterday and will not see them tonight. They are cared for by their governess, who follows strict routines and keeps detailed notes on their behavior and learning. As the sun begins to set, the Queen is helped once more into a new gown. Blue velvet this time, trimmed with ermine. Her hair is brushed and pinned. The circlet placed carefully on her brow feels heavier than it did this morning. Or perhaps she is simply more tired. She closes her eyes for a moment as the last pin is fixed. Tomorrow will look the same. The faces will change. The gowns, the letters, the gossip. But the rhythm will remain unchanged. And somewhere in the silence of her chamber, as the footsteps of her ladies retreat down the corridor, and the fire begins to dim once again, a single question echoes quietly in her mind. Is this what power was meant to feel like? The hall is already warm with the heat of many bodies when the queen enters. Dozens of courtiers rise from their benches at once. The gesture is automatic, almost theatrical, yet still threaded with real reverence. She glides forward, careful not to step on the hem of her velvet gown, the circlet on her brow gleaming faintly beneath the torchlight. Her gaze does not flinch. She knows exactly where to look. Never too long at one face, never too low, never too direct. A queen must be seen, but never exposed. The king greets her with a nod. No words. He is surrounded by his war council, broad-shouldered knights and aged advisors, one hand already lifting his goblet as he returns to a conversation about fortifications on the northern border. She sits beside him, as expected, her chair smaller than his but placed slightly forward. Symbolic, of course. Every inch in this hall means something. The table before her is laid with fine trenchers and polished goblets. Plates carved from pewter and small bowls, filled with sauces, salts, and sweetmeats. Servants move like shadows, careful not to disturb the air too loudly. The steward recites the first course aloud as it is presented. A roasted swan, decorated with its own feathers, its beak dipped in gold leaf. It is beautiful, absurd, and largely inedible. She takes only a sliver. There is conversation, but not of the intimate kind. Across the table, a countess tells a story of her estate being overrun by frogs. Another lady chuckles and recalls a monk who claimed to banish vermin with relics. The queen smiles, gently, and folds her hands in her lap. She is not expected to lead these exchanges, only to smooth them. Her role is presence, a living emblem of peace and fertility. Her opinions are a rare commodity, to be dispensed carefully and only when the king is absent or distracted. She once spoke out of turn, 2 winters ago, about a tax levied on wool merchants. The silence that followed still rings in her memory like the toll of a great iron bell. So she nods. She listens. She chews politely and drinks a little. In truth, she is tired. But supper is not the end. There is music afterward. A small group of minstrels has been brought in from the town. Their instruments carefully tuned, and their sleeves richly embroidered to match the occasion. The harpist is nervous. The lutenist too loud. Yet their notes fill the hall like incense, soothing and heavy. A jester tumbles across the stone floor, bells on his cap jingling with each roll. He tells a tale of a pig who became a priest. The laughter it provokes is genuine, if a bit forced. The queen laughs too. She must. Laughter in court is as much a performance as prayer. When the meal concludes, the queen rises with the king. A scribe records the moment in the court annals, not the content of the conversation, but the gesture, the order, the composure. Tomorrow it will be relayed to nobles far and wide. The queen smiled. The queen stood with grace. The queen wore blue. Upstairs, her chambers have been warmed. A copper basin of water awaits near the fire, and a soft cloth has been laid across the back of a carved oak chair. Her hair is unpinned by one of her ladies-in-waiting, brushed slowly until it falls in loose waves down her back. She feels the tug of the bristles, the pull of her scalp beneath the skin. She closes her eyes and breathes deeply. Another lady loosens the laces of her gown. It takes nearly as long to undress her as it did to prepare her that morning. Beneath the gown is a shift, then a nightgown, each layer added with its own quiet ritual. A warm cup of wine with honey is offered to her. She accepts it, though she only sips. Sleep comes easier when she is not so full. Before bed, the queen writes a letter. Not one to be dictated, not one that her clerk will see. She writes with her own hand, ink dark and slow. On rough parchment she hides in the folds of her psalter. It is addressed to no one, or to someone she has never met, or perhaps to herself. I do not feel like a queen, only like a woman behind thick walls, wrapped in wool, told not to ask why. She leaves it unsigned. The bed is turned down. The fire is fed once more. A maid curls into a corner chair with a spindle in hand. She will keep watch until the third hour of the night, then be replaced by another. Even in sleep, the queen is guarded. The heavy curtains are drawn around her bed. Within them, she finds darkness and silence so complete it feels like being buried alive. She lies on her back and watches the flickering of firelight through a slit in the curtains. Tomorrow, she will receive visitors from a neighboring duchy. Tomorrow, there will be more letters, more meals, more music. Tomorrow, there will be laughter again, and she will smile, because the crown is not something you wear once. It is something that binds to the skin. And while kings may rage and storm, while dukes plot and barons bicker, queens are meant to endure, to suffer beautifully, to wait wordless, to survive on presence alone. And yet, as sleep begins to pull her toward the depths of forgetting, she wonders if no one ever knew her true thoughts, her real voice, or her secret griefs. Did she ever truly exist at all? The morning after the feast arrives quietly. The castle stirs before she does. Footsteps in the corridor, the low grind of iron hinges as the kitchen doors open, the faint neigh of horses in the yard below. A distant bell tolls from the chapel tower, marking the 7th hour of daylight. Light presses faintly through the curtains around her bed, and the air holds the same chill it always does, no matter the season. But today feels different. There is no feast planned, no foreign dignitary to greet, no elaborate ceremony awaiting her signature. And yet the quiet seems sharper than usual, like the edge of a knife she cannot see. She sits up slowly, blinking against the dim glow of morning. A maid approaches, gently lifting the curtains aside, placing a soft robe around her shoulders. The robe is lined with fur, but even that doesn't quite chase away the cold that has settled into her bones. She moves to the window. Outside, the fog clings to the rooftops. The stone courtyard glistens with dew. A group of stable boys lead horses out into the open, their breath misting in the air. A goose honks near the well. A child, likely the baker's youngest, darts past the chapel door with a bundle of kindling. These are the living things she watches. They seem freer than she has ever been. The queen does not dress immediately. Instead, she sits before her small writing table and unrolls the same piece of parchment she left half-finished a week ago. It is a letter to her daughter, now old enough to write back. But what is there to say? That she misses her, that she wishes she could walk the halls of her childhood home, hand in hand, away from court and its rituals? That her own mother once wrote the same kind of letter, never sent? Instead, she writes about the garden. She describes how the roses by the north wall bloomed late this year, how the bees lingered on the lavender longer than expected. She does not mention the council arguments, or the political match being arranged for her daughter's future. There is no need. Her daughter will learn soon enough that royal blood is a currency, not a comfort. As she finishes, there's a knock at the chamber door. It is the steward bowing deeply. A messenger has arrived. He brings news from the eastern counties, a border dispute, a dispute that requires the king's attention. But the king has not risen. He is not in the hunting fields. He is not in his study. He is ill. By mid-afternoon, the queen stands beside her husband's bed. His face is pale, his breath shallow. The room is heavy with incense, and priests linger at the doorway. There is murmuring, words she's heard before, spoken over other bodies, in other rooms. Holy words, final words. And yet she feels very little. Not cruelty, not relief, just the weight of what now must be done. There will be decisions to make, announcements to deliver, mourning veils to prepare. The court must be informed. A regency may be required until her son is of age, and she will be expected to lead, but not with power, with poise. She returns to her chambers and removes her circlet. It leaves a faint line across her brow. Her maid sets it down with care, but the metal still clinks against the table as if unwilling to stay silent. For the next days, everything becomes ceremony. The king's body is washed in wine and herbs. Robes of crimson are laid over his form. Candles are lit in every corridor. Bells toll in every nearby village. Mourning is painted on every wall, stitched into every tunic. And through it all, she remains the same, composed, dignified, present. No one asks what she feels. Perhaps they assume queens are above grief. Or perhaps they believe her duty consumes even that. At night, she lies awake longer than usual. Her bed is colder, larger. Fire crackles too loudly. She thinks of her children, how they will react, how they will remember him. She thinks of her own father, long buried, whose face she can barely recall. She thinks of the future, of her son's coronation, and the lessons she will need to whisper behind closed doors, never to be known beyond the curtains of the private chamber. For queens do not govern, not truly, but they shape those who will, and that is its own kind of power. Quieter one, a lonelier one. Weeks pass and the kingdom adjusts. Visitors come with condolences and gifts. Her attire changes. Blacker silks, longer veils. But her routine does not. She still kneels each morning. She still eats alone. She still embroiders dragons and saints and symbols of piety. And in the garden she walks now, though never far, always with a chaperone and always in silence. Sometimes she thinks about the girls who grew up with her. One was sent to a convent. Another died in childbirth before the age of 20. One, she hears, lives happily in a modest manner, married to a knight without title, raising 5 children in the hills. She wonders, not for the first time, what that life might have felt like, if it would have been quieter, or louder in a warmer way. But such thoughts are luxuries she cannot afford. She is still the queen, and queens do not look back, not for long. Instead, she turns once more to her desk, her ink, her parchment. She begins a new letter, not to her daughter, not to any courtier, but to no one in particular. She writes, "There is a kind of power in patience, in the long game of silence, in knowing that even if no one remembers the shape of your words, they may still carry the shape of your life." She places the letter in her psalter, folded, unsent. The fire flickers. The chamber darkens. Outside, the bells begin to ring again, and so continues the quiet reign of a woman never meant to rule, but always meant to remain. The corridors of the castle were quieter these days. Quieter, not because fewer feet pass through them, but because they move differently now. Slower, softer, as if the very stones had been told to hush. The queen was with child, and that meant the kingdom waited, not in open celebration, not yet, but in held breath. It was her fourth pregnancy, and though the court spoke of it with the same formal optimism as all the others, she knew the truth few dared voice aloud. 2 had ended before the 6th month. 1 in a stillbirth, just hours after labor. The midwife had whispered prayers over that tiny, motionless form before wrapping it in linen and handing it to the priest. No name had been given. And now, here she was again, swollen with possibility, cloaked in fragility, held in reverence and fear. In the early months, she had continued her royal duties, attending feasts, receiving noble guests, overseeing the embroidery of yet another altar cloth. But as her belly grew rounder, the queen was slowly withdrawn from the life of the court. Not by force exactly, but by tradition. She was moved to the upper chambers, a sunlit set of rooms facing the inner courtyard. There, she would wait, pray, and prepare. This practice had a name: confinement. But to her, it felt more like exile. Everything in these chambers was softened, her pillows overstuffed, her windows curtained with silks, her meals served lukewarm and bland. Spices, she had been told, might unbalance her humors. Loud music was forbidden. Even laughter, it was believed, could jostle the womb in dangerous ways. What was left in its absence was not peace, but a peculiar kind of dread. Each day began the same. 2 maids entered to freshen the linens, then helped her sit upright. Her back ached constantly now. Her ankles swelled no matter how she was positioned. Physician would arrive before midday, touch her pulse, examine her tongue, and declare her well-balanced or slightly warm. He would mix dried rose petals into her wine. He told her to avoid excitement, as if excitement could find her here. By the 4th month, the queen could feel the baby shift. Not a kick, just a flutter, like a moth turning over in a heavy jar. It made her hold her breath each time, because movement meant life, movement meant hope, and stillness. Stillness meant something else. Her ladies-in-waiting tried their best. They brought news from court, light gossip, new fashions, a poorly tuned harpist who had made the king chuckle. One lady read aloud from a book of saints. Another taught her a new knot in embroidery thread, designed to bind blessings into the fabric. But all their efforts skimmed the surface of something deeper, something they couldn't quite reach, or wouldn't dare to, because behind the soft laughter and the murmured prayers was the fear they all shared. Childbirth was not merely a passage, it was a crossing, and many women never returned from it, even queens, especially queens. The pressure to deliver an heir was both unspoken and absolute. Her husband had not said it outright, but the way he looked at her now had changed. Not with cruelty, but with expectation. He was polite, attentive even, but careful, like she was a vessel holding something that didn't quite belong to her. The weight of that truth bore down on her at night. The bedchamber felt cavernous then. She would lie awake beneath layers of wool and velvet, listening to the fire crackle, and the wind hum through the arrow slits. Her hands rested on her belly as if to shield it from something she couldn't name. She thought of the other queens, the ones in history books who bore sons like clockwork, whose wombs were praised in songs and chronicled by scribes. And she thought of the others, the silent ones, the forgotten one, the ones who died unnamed in childbirth. Their tombstones eroded, their stories flattened into footnotes. One evening, as the sky turned amber beyond the lattice window, her childhood nurse came to visit. She was older now, with white threads streaking her hair and hands that trembled slightly as she poured the queen's tea. They sat together in silence for a long time before the queen finally asked, "Were you afraid when you gave birth?" The nurse nodded once. "Yes, but I did it in a cottage, with a midwife who knew my name, and no one watched me except the people who loved me." Queen said nothing in reply, because when the day of labor came for her, there would be witnesses. The midwife, the priest, the shaman, a lady of noble birth to verify the child's legitimacy, and, should anything go wrong, a scribe, ready to record not just the outcome, but the exact hour it occurred. Queens, after all, belong to history, even in their final moments. Especially then. By the 6th month, her belly was round and high, and her gait had slowed. Walking felt like shifting stone inside her pelvis. The baby kicked more now. Sharper, stronger. Her appetite returned briefly. But every meal brought fresh worry. Was she eating the right things? Enough? Too much? The cook consulted old herbal texts. The maids whispered about omens. One dropped a tray and cried for an hour, convinced it was a sign. Even she wasn't sure it wasn't. Letters arrived from distant relatives, wishing her health and strength. Some were sincere, others were political. A nobleman sent her a relic, a small bone said to be from Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth. She wore it pinned near her heart, not because she believed in its power, but because she needed something to believe in. She prayed more now, longer, not just for the baby, but for the moment itself, that it would come quickly, that it would pass without pain, or at least not too much, that she would still be here when it was over. One morning as she sat by the fire, her embroidery resting untouched in her lap, she asked the midwife what to expect. The woman had gray eyes and a voice like thick linen. She didn't soften her answer. There will be blood. There will be pain. There may be screaming or not. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes the quiet is the worst part. The queen nodded and looked down at her belly. The baby shifted, and with it, a question bloomed in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. What happens if I fail again? Not just as a mother, but as a queen. The night it began. The castle slept. Rain had fallen steadily since dusk, drumming gently on the slanted stone roof above the queen's chamber. The scent of wet earth lingered in the air, mixing with the faint traces of rosewater and tallow smoke. A fire burned low in the hearth. Beside it, one of the maids dozed upright in her chair, needlework slipping from her lap. The queen, by now too heavy with child to sleep deeply, lay half waking, watching the dancing firelight throw long shadows across the tapestries. It started with a tightening, deep and dull, like the slow twist of a rope inside her. Not pain at first, just pressure, a strange awareness, as though her body had turned its attention inward, preparing. She didn't cry out, not yet. Instead, she sat upright, one hand pressed to her belly. The room tilted slightly, as it always did when she moved too quickly. Her legs tingled. Her ribs felt bruised from within. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. 8. Then another wave came, stronger this time. She reached for the bell rope. Within minutes, the room filled. Not with panic, but with motion. Women moved with purpose. One stirred the coals. Another lit more candles. A maid fetched warm water while another gathered the birthing linens. Boiled, folded, and ready for days. The midwife arrived with her satchel, eyes calm, mouth set in a firm line. She touched the queen's wrist. felt her pulse, and nodded to the others. It was time. The queen was helped from her bed and led to the birthing chair. A strange wooden frame, low to the ground, with two sturdy arms for gripping and a wide opening beneath. It was the same chair used by her mother, and her mother's mother before that. A relic of survival, a throne of pain. Outside, a page was sent to rouse the priest, another to inform the king. He would not attend. That was custom. Royal men did not witness birth. They waited for outcomes, not the agony that birthed them. His part would come later, when the infant was cleaned, wrapped, and, hopefully, declared male. Green tried not to think of him now. Instead, she focused on her breathing. Each contraction came like a tide, rising, breaking, then receding. The midwife's voice was low, rhythmic, almost musical. Breathe in, my lady. Let it move through you. The queen gripped the arms of the chair, her knuckles pale. Sweat trickled along her temples despite the cool air. Time unraveled. Minutes lost meaning. Someone placed a damp cloth on her forehead. Another woman prayed aloud in Latin. A third offered her a tincture made of valerian and honey. She drank it without question. Every few minutes, the midwife knelt between her knees, listening, watching. Good signs, she whispered once, though she didn't say why. But with each hour that passed, something in the queen's chest tightened. Not just her body, but her mind, coiling, racing. The pain was no longer distant or manageable. It had become raw, deep. Her breathing grew shallow. A wave hit hard, harder than the ones before. She gasped, slumping forward, and a sharp cry escaped her lips. The room stilled, then resumed. The midwife did not look away. Push, Your Grace, she said, voice still calm. It must be now. So she did. Once, then again, and again. Each time, the pain lit her spine like fire. Her vision blurred. She tasted iron. She felt something shift inside her, like a plate of stone breaking away. Then, as she gripped the armrests and pushed with everything she had, a scream tore from her throat. Loud, primal, uncontrollable. And with it, the child emerged. A single cry pierced the air. Dar-da-dee. Immediate. Alive. The queen collapsed back against the chair, chest heaving, face damp with tears and sweat. She heard voices, relief, movement, someone murmuring prayers. The midwife held the child up briefly, inspecting it quickly by firelight. Then she turned to the priest, standing just outside the curtain, and said, "A son." The priest crossed himself. So did the maids. The queen did not move. A boy. It should have felt triumphant, but all she could feel was the hollow ringing in her ears, the pounding of her pulse, the burning ache from hips to ribs. Her eyes fluttered shut. The world spun. The baby was taken to be cleaned, wrapped in white linen, then placed gently in her arms. He was small, red-faced. His tiny hands opened and closed like sea creatures learning to swim. For a moment, she stared at him in silence. Then she whispered, barely loud enough to be heard, "You must live. You must live longer than I can hold you." And for the first time that night, she wept, not from the pain, but from the weight of the hope now resting in her arms. Hope that had a name already chosen, a lineage ready to inherit, a throne waiting in the future, and no memory of the blood and agony that had brought him here. Her ladies rejoiced quietly. The scribe recorded the time. The wet nurse stood by, waiting her turn. The queen was helped to her bed again, the chair wiped down, the linens bundled, cleaned, erased. Soon, this chamber would be cleared, and visitors would arrive to congratulate her. There would be music, toasts, feasting. Chronicles would write of the prince's safe arrival, but not of her cries, not of the fear, not of the way her body trembled still, long after the child had been taken from her arms to be fed. As she lay there in the dim light, one arm draped across her belly where he had once kicked, she whispered again into the empty room, "And if I had not survived, would anyone have remembered I was here at all?" The bells rang across the courtyard that morning, not with urgency, but with purpose. Hans had been born, a healthy boy, and the castle stirred to life with quiet celebration. Servants moved briskly with garlands of dried herbs. Pages delivered the news to nearby manors. The kitchens prepared trays of sweetened almonds and honeyed oat cakes for the household. The priest said mass in honor of the birth, praising Saint Margaret and the Virgin Mary in equal breath. But inside the Queen's chambers, everything had slowed. She lay still, propped upright by pillows, her face pale and sunken, her lips dry despite the cup of broth pressed gently to them every few hours. The wet nurse had taken the infant after the second feeding. Custom dictated that a queen should not nurse. Her body, after all, had other duties. So the boy was gone now, swaddled in soft linen, sleeping under the watchful eyes of attendants elsewhere in the nursery. The queen was not allowed to see him again till evening. She had been told this was for her rest, but rest would not come. Her body ached from its core outward. Her muscles trembled even in stillness. Each breath stretched the bruises beneath her ribs. She felt open, emptied, and somehow less than whole. Her midwife checked her frequently, whispering quiet encouragements, examining for signs of fever or bleeding. So far, all was well, but the queen remained silent. She said nothing of the dreams that hovered just at the edge of sleep, shadows moving across torchlight, whispers of infants who never cried. She said nothing of the fear that rose suddenly in her throat each time she blinked. She did not ask for her son, nor for the king, nor for the priest. Instead, she stared out the window. The rains had ended, and the sky had cleared. Crows circled above the parapets, and smoke curled from the towers into a sky of clean, cold blue. Below, she could see a gardener trimming the rosemary bushes by the edge of the chapel wall. Each cut was clean, methodical, like erasing parts of something once wild. Visitors came and went. The king entered late that afternoon. He smiled, offered a polite kiss to her forehead, and praised her strength. He did not ask how she felt. He praised the boy. Strong lungs, he said, a firm grip already. The priest had performed a provisional baptism. They would plan the full christening within a week. She nodded, offered a faint smile, and watched him leave. He did not see the tremble in her hand as she reached for the edge of her coverlet. That evening, when the child was brought to her again, she held him differently than before. Not with joy exactly, nor awe, but with the care of someone who knew just how fragile breathing could be. He opened his mouth in a yawn, blinked at the candlelight, then settled quietly into her chest. She studied his face. He had her mouth, perhaps, the shape of the brow, maybe his father's. But it was too soon to tell, too soon to see who he would become. And yet, he was already being written. The scribes had begun recording the hour of his birth, the names of witnesses, the lineage he descended from. He would be schooled in Latin and law. He would be knighted before he was 14. He would be told the world was his. But would he ever know the cost of that first breath? The pain that carved it into the world? The loneliness that followed? The queen kissed his brow and returned him to the nurse. He was fed and taken away again. swaddled like a symbol, fussed over by attendants who barely knew his name, but already knew his destiny. She was left in the quiet once more. The chamber had been cleaned. The birthing linens were burned. The wooden chair returned to storage. A fresh fire crackled in the hearth. A new candle had been lit near the altar. Outside her window, the rosemary had been trimmed into perfect shape. The midwife returned that night with a cup of valerian tea. The queen drank it slowly, each sip pulling her further from the present, loosening the tightness behind her. She was too tired to speak, too tired to think. She simply lay back, eyes open, watching the flickering ceiling. And yet, a thought floated up from somewhere deep in her. She had done what was asked. She had brought forth life. But the silence afterward, the quiet, deep, echoing silence, was not something anyone had warned her about. It was not in the prayers, not in the saints' tales, not in the tapestry stories of queens and miracles. It was hers alone. And in that silence, she whispered into the dark, "I lived. I remember. Let that be enough." Long before the feast began, the queen already knew what would be served. She had not planned the menu. That task fell to the steward of the kitchens, who worked under the direction of the Lord Chamberlain and the court's dietary physician. Still, she was expected to approve the final list, an endless scroll of meats and fruits, sauces and spiced dishes, all carefully selected to reflect dignity, power, and most of all, restraint. Her opinion had not been asked. It rarely was when food was involved. Despite being the one expected to sit in full view of the court, dressed in layers of brocade and velvet under hot torchlight, smiling while chewing duck tongue or cold eel pie, she was given no say in the matter. Queens, after all, did not eat for themselves. They ate for diplomacy, for piety, for appearances. And so the table was set. It stretched across the great hall like the keel of a ship. Broad, heavy, and heaving with silverware, goblets, and thick white cloth. Beneath it, the floor had been swept clean of rushes. New herbs were scattered in their place. Lavender, thyme, pennyroyal. A servant would burn dried rosemary beneath the dais to mask the smell of sweat and smoke. All this preparation, all this splendor, for a meal that the queen would barely taste. The first course began with a procession. Servants filed in with trays held above their shoulders, their faces carefully blank. The dishes gleamed. Whole roasted peacocks with feathers reattached to their tails, pies sculpted in the shapes of castles, towers of sweetmeats stacked like cathedrals. Each dish was designed to impress and to test. Would she flinch at the tongue of an ox? Would she decline the spiced porridge served with duck blood? Every glance her way was a measure. Every bite a performance. To eat too much was gluttony. To eat too little was offense. To refuse a dish was a risk. And to show pleasure, true pleasure, was something queens were rarely afforded. She smiled as always, lifted her goblet when the toast came, dabbed the corners of her mouth with a cloth of fine linen. She praised the cook, even though her stomach had soured at the scent of preserved fish laid across a bed of spiced apples. Only once years ago had she let her face betray her. It had been a feast held in honor of a visiting prince from Navarre. The final course had been a molded pudding, solidified goat's milk flavored with cloves, meant to show off the court's exotic spices. She had taken one bite and had nearly gagged. A flash of disgust passed across her face, quick as a blink. But the prince had seen it. He laughed. She never did it again. In truth, she rarely ate much at all during feasts. The bulk of her meals came later, in the quiet of her chamber, when the fire had burned low and the maids had been dismissed. Then, a trusted servant would bring her a plate of soft cheese, honeyed bread, and a warm tisane brewed with fennel and mint. These were the flavors she preferred. Simple, kind, unassuming. Not the dishes of grandeur, not the illusions. At official meals, the food might arrive cooled, overcooked, or barely touched. The queen would chew slowly, nod approvingly, and pass the plate along. To eat too quickly was improper. To ask for more of anything was worse. She was, above all else, meant to embody temperance, even when hunger gnawed at her stomach, even when a bite of undercooked fowl made her ill for a week. She once asked her nurse, long before she became queen, why so many dishes were made with sugar and vinegar. The nurse had laughed and said, "Because if it tastes strange, it must be noble." Now, she understood. Strange flavors meant foreign trade. Foreign trade meant wealth, and every strange bite in her mouth was a sign of the kingdom's power, its reach, its might, its appetite. There was no place for comfort at the royal table. No warmth, no familiarity. She thought often of her childhood meals. Trencher bread thick with bean stew, salted pork roasted with wild onions, fruit plucked that same morning from the orchard behind the abbey wall, meals eaten quickly, surrounded by laughter, and cleared with crusty cloths and loud hands. Now, food was quiet, staged, reverent. Even her cutlery was ceremonial, thin-handled knives shaped like daggers, spoons shaped like scallop shells. Her goblets were too heavy. The salt cellar on her side of the table was carved from crystal. No one ever asked if she liked it. Of course she didn't. But liking wasn't part of the role. Only eating. Only enduring. The king, meanwhile, ate heartily. He tore into roasted venison with his hands, laughed with his mouth full, dripped grease onto his embroidered sleeve without notice. No one commented. It was expected of him. Strength and appetite were brothers. But queens? Queens must appear above their cravings. Controlled, composed, even in hunger, even in revulsion, even when the scent of a particular dish reminded her of the child she had lost during her last confinement. The one born too early, whose breath had barely fluttered before fading. She had gone into labor the night after a feast. She still remembered the taste of the cinnamon-dusted quail. For years, she could not eat it again, but still appeared on menus, because the steward did not know. It's no one thought to ask. She once dreamed of holding a feast of her own choosing, a small one. No nobles, no priests, just the women from the kitchens and the castle yard. A fire burning low, bread warm and torn by hand, bowls of stewed greens and spiced carrots, pears poached in wine, music not from the minstrels but from memory, laughter without formality. But that kind of feast belonged to a world she did not live in. Here, she was watched. Here, she was tasted. Here, she was meant to smile through every mouthful. No matter how cold, the banquet hall glowed with the light of over 100 candles, their flames trembling softly in the heavy air. Smoke curled into the rafters and clung to the tapestries like ghosts of past feasts. The scent of roasted meats mingled with burnt wax and stale ale. The queen sat at the high table, elevated above the rest, a golden circlet pressing gently into her temples, her hands resting in stillness on the arms of her carved oaken chair. Tonight's occasion was a diplomatic banquet, held in honor of a visiting delegation from the north. There were barons, envoys, and their wives, all seated below on long benches flanking the central aisle. Minstrels played gently from the corner. Pages bustled between courses, carrying pewter platters and pitchers of wine too heavy for their small hands. The queen's gown, an elaborate brocade stitched with the motif of climbing roses, fit too tightly around her ribs. Cinched earlier by her ladies-in-waiting, she could barely draw a full breath. The jewels at her throat felt like weights rather than ornaments, but no complaint passed her lips. Her discomfort was part of the unspoken contract she upheld each day. To appear, to endure, and to uphold the of serene majesty at all costs. As the first course arrived, potted lamprey served in a crust of spiced bread, she picked up her knife with delicate fingers and forced her face into a mild expression of interest. The fish had been cooked slowly in wine and herbs, then chilled and jellied, until it quivered like a strange sea creature on her plate. She cut a sliver, lifted it to her mouth, and chewed it slowly. It was soft, slippery, the flavor too strong. She swallowed, then lifted her goblet and sipped sweet wine to chase it down. The dish had been chosen deliberately. Lampreys were rare this time of year and costly. To serve them was to send a message. The kingdom was prosperous, the kitchen well-stocked. The queen composed. When the second course arrived, a pie filled with almond paste and saffron-spiced chicken. She smiled and nodded toward the steward, who stood watching from the shadows like a hawk. He bowed slightly, satisfied. She took another bite, smaller this time, and let the rest remain untouched. She had learned long ago that gestures mattered more than appetites. Below the dais, laughter erupted as one of the visiting barons recounted a story of a drunken friar and a barrel of cider. The king laughed loudly and slapped the table with the flat of his palm, nearly knocking over his cup. The queen smiled, but did not laugh. Her role was not to outshine him. She laughed when he laughed, never a moment before, never too much. The third course came with ceremony. A roast swan, its wings outstretched as if in flight, its beak painted gold, and a ribbon tied around its slender neck. A marvel of kitchen engineering. It had been skinned and cooked, then redressed in its own feathers for dramatic effect. Gasps rippled through the hall. It was beautiful. Ghastly, perhaps, but impressive. The queen's stomach turned at the scent. She thought of the bird alive, gliding over the lake near her father's estate, white wings gleaming in sunlight. Now it lay motionless, its chest cracked open, glistening with fat and black pepper. The steward approached to offer her a cut from the breast. She nodded graciously and accepted. A slice was placed upon her trencher. She chewed slowly, methodically, her thoughts wandering away from the room. She remembered a simpler time, before queenship, before corsets and feasts and scrutiny. A summer afternoon in her youth, when she had eaten cherries straight from the tree, her fingers stained red, the juice running down her wrist. She had sat barefoot by the orchard wall with her cousin, eating until they were full, laughing with abandon. No knives, no formality, no expectations. Here, she had not eaten until she was full in years. The courses continued. Peas pudding, roast quails and plum sauce, tarts of eel and marjoram, candied ginger, a tower of wafers dusted with powdered sugar and violets. The queen touched most of them but tasted few. Her stomach rebelled in quiet protest. Still, she smiled. Still, she praised the cook. Still, she drank the thin wine and nodded at all the right moments. Her ladies-in-waiting, seated just behind her, remained alert. One leaned forward to adjust her sleeve. Another refilled her goblet. They knew this routine well. They had seen the quiet battles behind the jeweled mask, the way she breathed through nausea, the way she tilted her body to ease the ache in her side. But none of them would ever speak of it. As the final course was cleared and the guests began to rise, the queen stood, her legs stiff from hours of stillness. The king extended an arm. She took it, stepping down from the dais slowly, with practiced grace. The guests bowed. Some applauded. The minstrels began a soft melody, and the procession began. Out of the hall, through the torchlit corridor, back to the silence of her chambers. Once there, her ladies removed her gown with care, loosened the stays, unpinned the jewels, unbraided her hair. A warm basin of water was brought to soak her feet. She sat quietly, eyes distant, the scent of roasted swan still clinging to her skin. She ate nothing else that night, just a sip of barley tea, and before she lay down, she whispered into the dimness, not to anyone in particular, "What is the worth of a crown that cannot feed the one who wears it?" There were moments, rare, hushed, and hidden, when the queen ate for herself. They were never scheduled, never spoken of afterward. They happened in slivers of time between duties and dusk. When the courtiers had gone, the music had stopped, and the flickering candles in her solar began to lean into shadows. It was in these moments that the performance fell away, and the queen, no longer dressed in finery or flanked by watchful eyes, returned to something closer to herself. It often began with a knock, a soft, polite tap on the outer door. Her handmaid, Agnes, the quietest among them, would peek in with a covered bowl in her arms, and a conspiratorial glint in her tired eyes. She never said much. She didn't need to. The queen would smile faintly and gesture to the small table by the window, and Agnes would set it down, always with care, always with the same respect as if she were placing down relics. Inside the bowl, something simple, thick vegetable stew, flatbread still warm from the hearth, a slice of pear drizzled with wildflower honey, a wedge of goat cheese wrapped in linen. None of it bore the polish or presentation of the royal kitchen. The vegetables weren't sculpted into flowers. The plate wasn't made of pewter, and yet it was food the queen could taste without restraint. She ate slowly, not out of etiquette, but because she wanted it to last. These stolen suppers reminded her of the girl she once was, the girl who had sat on stone steps eating apple slices with her fingers, who had snuck bits of salted meat from the servants' quarters when the household fasted, who had picked blackberries until her fingers turned purple and her tongue sang with tartness. Now she measured everything, how she chewed, when she paused, whether or not she sipped wine before answering a question. She had learned the choreography of court meals so well that she could perform it without thought. But here, in the stillness of her solar, she didn't need choreography. She only needed warmth. One evening, after a long day of audiences and formalities, she asked Agnes where the bread had come from. The girl hesitated, then confessed it was from the baker's wife in the village. She sent it with her boy, she added quickly, just in case her grace needed something soft. The queen didn't scold her. Instead, she took another bite and nodded. It was soft. It was perfect. There was a time, not long after her marriage, when she had tried to bring change to the court kitchens. She had spoken, gently, about simpler fare, healthier choices, meals that would not leave her ill for days, or set half the nobility asleep mid-course. But her suggestions were politely received, noted, and then never discussed again. Elaborate dishes were a tradition, and tradition in court was law. To question a tradition was to question the order of things. So she stopped asking, and she learned instead to survive within it. But survival didn't mean acceptance. Not entirely. She kept her private meals, quietly, sparingly, just enough to remind herself that food could be nourishment, not theater. that her mouth, though painted and controlled, was still her own. That flavor did not need fanfare. She found small joys in these moments. A carrot pulled from the garden behind the chapel, sweet, earthy, real. A plum so ripe it burst before she could finish it. A crust of brown bread, dipped in broth, and eaten beside the fire. She once laughed, truly laughed, when a kitchen boy brought her a meat pie that had cracked open in the oven and looked like it had sprouted wings. It was absurd, ugly, delicious. She had eaten it in full. No knife, no spoon, just her hands. That night, she had slept better than she had in months. The great banquets continued, of course. The swans, the gilded fruit, the towers of sugared almonds that looked like sculpture and tasted like chalk. She played her part. She complimented the cook. She touched her lips to the goblet when the toasts were made. But she no longer believed that dignity came from grandeur. She had learned that dignity could live in a bowl of stew eaten alone, in peace. And perhaps in time, others would too. In the years that followed, as her son grew into his title, and her presence shifted into something more ceremonial than political, the Queen made one final request to the steward: a daily meal, served to her privately, prepared by the gardener's wife. Nothing extravagant, nothing costly, just a plate of what the people ate. He had blinked in confusion, then bowed. He never questioned her again. It became routine. Her last years were quieter, slower. But in those quiet moments, she tasted again the life that had nearly been denied her in the name of ceremony. And with every bite she reclaimed a little more of the woman beneath the crown. No scribes recorded these meals. No portraits were painted of her sitting barefoot in her chamber, eating bread from a wooden plate. But she remembered, and as the sun set behind the towers and the bells rang for evening mass, she would sometimes sit alone by her window, a slice of cheese in one hand and a crust in the other, smiling softly to herself, not as queen, not as mother, not as symbol, but as a woman who, at last, was eating for no one but herself. She was barely 7 when she first heard the word comportment. It was spoken by her mother, not loudly, not angrily, but with that careful, measured tone noble women used when delivering a correction that must last a lifetime. The girl had been fidgeting during a visit from the bishop, unable to sit still on the high stool in the solar. Her feet had dangled, knocking softly against the legs of the chair, and her fingers had worried the hem of her sleeve. After the bishop left, her mother knelt to her level, smoothed the fabric flat again, and said gently, "You must learn to sit as if you were born to stillness. One day, all eyes will be watching." From that moment forward, the girl began her training in how not to be seen moving, how to exist inside a room without disturbing it. Years later, seated upon a cushioned throne in the center of a candlelit hall, the Queen recalled that lesson almost daily. Everything about her posture had been honed into ritual. The slope of her shoulders, the angle of her chin, the placement of her hands folded lightly at her waist. To slouch was to invite judgment. To yawn was to appear bored. To blink too often, to shift in one's seat, even to scratch. These were all offenses not recorded in law, but no less dangerous. Royalty, after all, was performance, and performance depended on stillness. In truth, her entire life had been a slow accretion of rules. There were rules for speaking, of course. A queen must never interrupt, never raise her voice. Her tone must remain gentle, measured, feminine, never rushed, never too certain, never too sharp. If asked a question in court, she was to pause before answering, as if weighed by grace itself. Certainty in a woman was only praised when it was quiet. There were rules for walking. Her steps were to be neither hurried nor dragging, neither too long nor too small. Her shoes must be soft-soled to avoid echoing down stone halls. Her skirts could never drag, nor sway too freely. Her presence was to glide, not enter. And there were rules for embroidery, endless embroidery. The queen often wondered if her fingers had memories separate from her mind. So instinctively did they reach for the needle. So naturally did they follow the rhythm of pull and pierce, pull and pierce. She had begun as a girl, learning simple crosses and vines. By adolescence, she was replicating saints' faces and royal crests. Now, her days were often bookended by hours with the hoop, seated among her ladies, stitching virtue into banners and altar cloths, while speaking of things she could not influence. Embroidery was not about beauty. Not really. It was a form of discipline, a test of patience, a language of obedience. A queen who embroidered was a queen who understood the value of quiet devotion. The cloth bore her prayers, never written, never spoken aloud, but sewn in thread and silence. And there were so many silences. Silences when a man at court said something foolish, but she could not correct him. Silences when her husband spoke of treaties she did not trust. Silences when a lady in waiting flinched too slightly to be seen by others. Silences when the messenger brought news from the borderlands, and no one looked her way, though her cousin's land was burning. She had learned to live inside those silences, to build a world within them. Stitched lines, prayerful breaths, half-finished thoughts kept carefully behind the eyes. And if there was bitterness, she never let it show, because bitterness had no place in the etiquette of queens. The rituals extended even to grief. When her first daughter had died in infancy, the mourning had followed its expected form. Black gowns for 40 days. No music. No feasts. She was to kneel in prayer at certain hours. She was to accept condolences with a bowed head. But when, days later, she had asked to hold the baby's linens one last time, just to feel the tiny sleeve in her fingers, she had been gently told it was no longer proper. So instead, she embroidered tiny roses over and over into the hem of a cloth intended for the chapel. She made 17 of them. No one ever asked why. These were the unwritten codes of court. They were not enforced by punishment or proclamation, but by gaze, by raised brows, by quiet remarks passed from mouth to mouth like perfumed smoke. And the queen had come to know them intimately. She once saw a foreign princess fail to rise quickly enough during a visit from the archbishop. The room went silent for a moment, not in shock, but in subtle calculation. From that day forward, the princess's influence began to shrink. Fewer invitations, fewer glances. Eventually, she returned to her homeland under the pretext of ill health. But everyone understood. Etiquette had its own blade, and it cut clean. The queen bore her own cuts, small, invisible. Years of being overlooked in meetings, dismissed in conversations, praised for her composure while her intellect sat untouched. Her thoughts were sharp, but her tongue had been dulled by decades of rules. She was not expected to rule, only to reign. And reigning meant sitting still, sewing, smiling, surviving. Yet even within those confines she found her moments. A knowing glance between women. A perfectly timed remark, sharp and subtle enough to land without leaving a mark. A stitch made intentionally off pattern, hidden in a sea of symmetry. Quiet rebellions that no one else would see, but that she felt. The throne she sat upon, carved with lions, gilded with age, was not comfortable. It never had been, but it was where she had learned to remain, unflinching. to outlast, to master the art of endurance so completely that others mistook it for ease. Even now, after all these years, she could hear her mother's voice in memory. Sit as if you were born to stillness. And she had. But sometimes, when no one was watching, she wondered, what would happen if I stood up before I was asked? They once believed that the court was made of stone. Stone walls, stone floors, stone towers rising above the mist of the surrounding forest. Cold, unchanging, dependable. But over time, she learned that the court was not made of stone at all. It was made of watching, not only eyes, watching. A deeper thing, a presence that settled over her like the weight of a winter cloak. Every hall she walked, every word she spoke, every step she took was absorbed by it. People watched her not with awe, but with expectation. Their invisible ledgers carried in the minds of noblemen and noblewomen, and she was always being tallied, evaluated, measured, by how she sat, how she responded, how much or how little she reacted. It wasn't that they wanted her to fail. It was simply that they had been taught to notice. A raised voice, an out-of-place gesture, a moment of stillness held too long or too briefly. Anything that disrupted the rhythm of what a queen ought to be could ripple through the court like a cracked mirror. Subtle, but unmistakable. So she learned to perfect her reflection. In public, she never stumbled, never rushed. When she entered a hall, her pace was slow and even. When she greeted a visiting duchess, her words were chosen with precise warmth, never too friendly, never too familiar. During prayers, her posture was faultless. During feasts, her appetite was scripted. Her laugh, when offered, landed like soft embroidery, light, elegant, harmless. But it was exhausting, because behind every polished moment was calculation. Because every day brought new eyes and new rules hidden within familiar ones. When a new lady-in-waiting arrived from Aragon, she brought with her a custom of curtsying with one foot behind the other, not slightly angled to the side as was done in the Queen's court. The deviation was tiny, a matter of inches, but it sparked conversation. How curious, someone whispered. Did the Queen not notice? Or she noticed. She noticed everything. That was the real crown. The burden of awareness, of remembering which hand to extend to which ambassador, of knowing which earl would take offense to being seated too far from the salt cellar, of smiling at the dowager countess who had once insulted her parentage, of keeping tally of which noble houses sent gifts for her birthday, and which simply sent letters. There were days when she envied the fools, the jester who could trip in the hallway and be met with laughter, the able boy who could speak too freely and be forgiven because no one cared what he thought. Even the visiting princesses, fresh from distant lands, naive and eager, could err and be indulged. But she was the queen, and queens were not allowed to be unguarded, not even in joy. She remembered once, during a spring festival, when a troop of children had been brought to the castle to sing songs and present floral offerings. One small girl, no more than 6, had stepped forward and handed the queen a garland of daisies with a gap-toothed smile. Without thinking, the queen had knelt and kissed the child's cheek. A moment of kindness, a moment of instinct. But afterward, her lady chamberlain had whispered, "Your grace, such familiarity may lessen your mystique." The bishop had nodded in agreement. Mystique. Taught, a word she had come to despise. It meant being known only in pieces, admired but never touched, respected but never loved. Even her private life was arranged to maintain distance. Letters she wrote were reviewed, Gifts she received were catalogued. Her schedule was governed by bells and clerks. If she visited the garden, she was followed. If she stood at the chapel alone, a lady would be sent to stand beside her. For propriety, they said. The queen could not be alone, not truly. And yet she was never fully among others either. She existed in a space, in between. At the embroidery table, she could find some refuge. Here, she and her ladies stitched together. But even in that circle of soft voices and spinning thread, etiquette reigned. The queen's hoop was passed to her with bowed heads. Her fingers never tangled. Her hands were never idle. The patterns she chose were recorded in detail, sometimes replicated by the younger girls in the court as practice. Her mistakes, rare as they were quietly corrected by the lady sitting closest, and no one ever spoke of them. But she noticed. She noticed the stitch she had placed one thread too low. She noticed the silence that followed. She noticed the gentleness of correction that came not from kindness, but from duty. One afternoon, as she sat embroidering the edge of a new altar cloth, she deliberately made the pattern asymmetrical. Just slightly. A single corner stitched with a leaf curved the wrong way. When the work was passed among the others, no one mentioned it. But the queen watched their faces. One lady's mouth twitched. Another raised an eyebrow. The steward passed behind them without comment, and she smiled. It was petty. It was childish. It was the only moment that day that felt entirely hers. Not long after, a whisper began among the courtiers. The queen, they said, had taken up a new artistic motif. Subtle irregularities meant to reflect humility. Some said it was symbolic. Others copied her pattern. The asymmetry became a trend. No one knew it had begun as rebellion. That was the beauty and the sorrow of her life. Even her defiance was absorbed by the rules and turned into fashion. She sometimes wondered whether she had disappeared completely beneath the surface of it all, whether there was still a self beneath the etiquette, the posture, the daily rituals, whether the girl who had once giggled with her cousins in the orchard still lived somewhere inside her, buried beneath layers of silk and silence. She never found the answer. But each night, before her prayers, she let herself sit alone in her chamber for a moment longer than necessary. Not in state, not in form, just sitting, feet tucked beneath her. No crown, no poise, no gaze watching her from across the room. And in those rare, borrowed moments of stillness, she remembered the difference between being watched and simply being. In the final years of her queenship, the rules remained, but her obedience to them shifted. It wasn't that she rebelled, not in any way that would make the scribes take note or the bishops raise their brows. No proclamations, no speeches, no sudden dramatic gestures. Her defiance, like the rest of her life, was quiet, intentional, folded into the fabric of the court like one wrong stitch in an otherwise perfect hem. She had long since learned that open defiance from a queen was not bravery, it was ammunition. A slip in decorum could be twisted, misquoted, passed from tongue to tongue until it became something else entirely. A sigh could be read as insult, a pause as hesitation. And yet, what power she did hold, what slivers of control she had gathered through years of endurance. She began to use with subtlety. It started with a chair. The queen had spent years sitting on the same carved throne at court functions. Stiff-backed, narrow, designed less for comfort than for presence. Her ladies knew how she would shift after an hour, how she would subtly reposition her knees, how she would flex her toes inside silk slippers to keep circulation from fading. But they never commented. The chair had been her station. But one winter morning, after rising from it with aching hips and cold-stiffened limbs, she requested another. Not from the carpenter, not from the steward, from the seamstress. "I would like a cushion," she said simply. "Something thick, made from my own wedding gown." The seamstress had hesitated. "Your Majesty, the gown is preserved." "I know. That's why it will do." Within a week, the cushion appeared. Plump, soft, stitched with the faint shimmer of fabric once worn on a spring day 2 decades earlier. She sat on it at the next council meeting, and though it caused a stir, no one dared question her directly. They bowed a little lower, spoke a little more carefully. She smiled the same way she always had. But something had shifted. She stopped wearing her tightest bodices. She began choosing darker colors in summer, lighter colors in winter. When the bishop commented that black in July was funereal, she replied softly, "Perhaps we all need reminding of the brevity of seasons." She left letters unanswered. Not many, but a few. Those filled with meaningless praise or thinly veiled requests for favor. She did not explain. She simply let silence speak on her behalf. And when her granddaughter came to court at age 12, trembling and wide-eyed, the queen instructed her not on how to walk or curtsy or smile. She handed her a blank piece of linen and said, "Make your own pattern. Do not copy mine." It was not open rebellion, but it was freedom. Small, steady, and her own. She continued her embroidery, of course. It had become her sanctuary, but her patterns changed. She no longer sewed saints or floral borders. Instead, she stitched scenes from memory. An apple tree, a frozen stream, a candlelit hallway from her girlhood convent. Things that had no meaning to the court, but everything to her. Some viewed her new work as abstract. Others called it eccentric. But the queen didn't care, because at last, her hands were doing more than obeying. They were remembering. One afternoon, in the quiet heat of late summer, she received a visitor from a neighboring kingdom. A young princess, newly betrothed, barely 15. The girl curtsied with trembling grace, eyes darting, lips pressed in a line. The queen invited her to sit beside her, not below. They spoke little. Instead, the queen offered her an embroidery hoop. Blank, unstarted. The girl hesitated. "I do not know the royal patterns." The queen smiled. "Then, invent one." That night, the queen sat by her window long after the castle had gone still. The candle burned low beside her. On her lap lay a square of unfinished cloth. The same leaf, sewn over and over, each one slightly different. A pattern of imperfection. A garden grown from defiance. She leaned back in her chair and let her shoulders rest fully, without correction. Her spine curved softly. Her hands relaxed. Her eyes drifted toward the stars above the high towers, stars that no crown had ever reached. And she thought, all my life, I followed the rules because I believed they made me strong. But perhaps true strength came the moment I stopped needing them. She would be remembered, surely, but not for her silence, not for her posture, not for her needlework. She would be remembered in the stitched corners, the blank spaces, the moments when she sat without being seen, and finally claimed the throne inside herself. The queen was not in chains. She was not behind iron bars. And yet, she was most certainly a prisoner. The room assigned to her was large, with a tall arched window and a view of the river below. There were tapestries on the walls, worn but clean, depicting scenes from the Book of Hours. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its frame carved with faded fleur-de-lis. A writing desk faced the window, though the inkwell atop it had long since dried out. Everything was in its place, and none of it belonged to her. This was not her castle, not her court, not even her country. She had arrived under guard a week ago. escorted not by footmen, but by armed knights in somber livery. No trumpets, no crowds. No, just silence. The silence of scandal. The silence of punishment disguised as propriety. She had not committed a crime in the way men understood it. She had not poisoned her husband, had not led troops into rebellion. She had simply fallen out of favor. And for a queen, that was crime enough. They called it protective confinement. They said it was for her own safety, that the political climate required discretion, that unrest among the nobles made her presence at court too complicated. But no matter how gently the words were spoken, their meaning was iron. She was not to leave the manor grounds. She was not to receive visitors without permission. She was not to write letters without oversight. She was, in all but name, exiled within her own marriage. The days passed in sameness. Each morning, she awoke to a quiet knock. A serving girl entered with a bowl of warm water and a plate of oatcakes and dried apples. She dressed without assistance. No ladies-in-waiting had been permitted to accompany her from court, and the maids assigned to her here spoke little beyond what was required. Steward of the household, an elderly man with eyes that never met hers, visited twice daily to inquire after her comfort, to inform her of permitted readings, and to remind her of the hour of vespers. Indeed, she never attended vespers, not out of defiance, simply because she could not bear to sit in that echoing chapel beneath the gaze of strangers and pretend to pray. Instead, she walked the perimeter of the garden. It was not large, walled on all sides, its hedges trimmed too severely, its roses past bloom. A gravel path curved around a central fountain that had long since gone dry. She circled it once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and once at dusk. It was the only freedom left to her, and she took it slowly, savoring the rhythm of her footsteps and the brief moments when the breeze lifted her veil and touched her cheek. She had once commanded rooms filled with nobles. She had once spoken treaties into being, but now her greatest exercise of will was choosing not to speak at all. That silence became its own armor. Inside the chamber, she returned again and again to the window. The river ran steadily below, its banks dotted with reeds and silent herons. On clear days, he could see a bridge in the distance, the faint outline of riders crossing. She imagined where they were going, whether any of them knew who sat watching from this high, forgotten room. She did not cry. Crying, after all, was a luxury for those with an audience. Instead, she wrote, with charcoal at first, on the backs of old letters, on the margins of pages torn from prayer books. The ink had been removed from her desk, but not the quill. She used it anyway, dipping the nib in a mixture of wine and soot. The words came slowly at first, then freely. She did not write of betrayal. She wrote of sensation, of the way the sunlight struck the stone wall at mid-morning, of the bird that nested just beneath her window, of the strange sweetness of solitude that arrived only after the bitterness had passed. It was the first time in years she had been alone with her thoughts, and it frightened her, because beneath the etiquette and the titles and the years of public performance, she found a voice she barely recognized, a voice that did not soften her opinions, a voice that did not ask permission to feel. She thought of other queens. Catherine de Valois, kept hidden after her husband's death. Isabella of France, accused of treason, and called a she-wolf by those who feared her might. Eleanor of Aquitaine, locked away for plotting with her sons. None of them had worn shackles in the beginning. Their prisons had names like Sanctuary and Retreat. Their guards had titles like escort and attendant, and yet they had been caged all the same. She wondered if they had also stood at windows and written on scraps. If they, too, had discovered that silence could be sharpened into purpose. By the second week, she had found a rhythm. She rose with the sun, wrote until midday, walked her 3 laps, and then sat in the farthest corner of her room, where the light struck the stone floor like a path. There, she listened, not to footsteps or bells, but to herself. She did not hate the king. She had loved him once, or tried to, but the love of a queen was never simple. It was duty. It was performance. It was faith sewn onto the back of a public banner and paraded until the fabric frayed. Still, she wished he had spoken to her before sending her away. A single word would have sufficed. Instead, he had sent a decree, not inked by his hand, but by one of his scribes, not sealed by his presence, but delivered by a silent rider. And now, here she was, alive, unwanted, unbent. What? She rose from her writing chair and walked to the window once more. Outside, the wind stirred the grass along the riverbank. The sky was the color of warm parchment. Far below, the bridge stood still, and for a moment, the queen imagined herself crossing it, not as a fugitive, not as royalty, but simply as a woman walking toward something unknown. And she whispered to no one, "You cannot cage a queen who has already unlearned how to kneel." The queen had begun to govern again, not through edicts, not through court sessions or councils, but through letters. They were not political in appearance. That was part of their design. Each one arrived in fine script on thick vellum, tied with a thread of pale green, a color she had once worn during her brief coronation procession. They carried news, but not commands. Questions, but not accusations. Her signature was nowhere upon them. Instead, they were signed simply, "A friend of your house." She sent them with riders who owed loyalty not to the king, but to old alliances, stitched long ago in favors and feasts and small forgotten mercies. The letters asked simple things. How was the harvest in the west? Was the bishop's son still seeking a bride? Had the smithy in the hill towns repaired the abbey bell? They did not name the court. They did not name her, but the recipients knew. And in their answers, returned weeks later by courier or merchant or word of mouth, she saw a different kind of map emerge. One not marked with borders or flags, but with whispers. The kind of map only a queen in exile could read. It began slowly to restore her. Not her crown, not her court, but her sense of weight in the world. She no longer drifted through the day with emptiness in her bones. Now, when she rose, it was with intent. Her steps to the window were measured. Her hand at the desk moved not out of habit, but with purpose. Her thoughts, once frayed by solitude, had become structured. Her prison had become her paper court. And though no trumpet announced it, and no chronicler recorded the moment, she ruled again, quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface of history. The steward who checked on her twice daily began to notice the change. Her eyes met his now, briefly, but directly. Her replies were more than nods. She thanked the maids by name, asked them where they were from, listened to their answers. They were small gestures, but in a world governed by unspoken rules, such things gathered meaning. The steward began staying longer. He brought news from the outer lands, perhaps more than he was allowed. He asked her questions, hesitantly at first. What had the court been like during her first year as queen? Did she remember the famine of 42? Was it true that she once negotiated a border truce during a feast? She answered each question as though it were a thread being drawn out slowly from an old tapestry. With care, with honesty. Not every memory was pleasant, but all of them were hers. One afternoon, after the steward departed and the maids had finished clearing her chamber, she walked to the corner where a small chest held her embroidery supplies. She had not stitched in months, not since her exile. But something called her now, not for decoration, for proof. She opened the chest, removed a small hoop and a folded cloth, and began again. This time, not with crests or religious icons. She stitched a bridge, the same bridge she saw every day from her window, its towers rising faintly in the distance. It spanned long and straight across the glinting river. The stitches were slow at first, uneven, but they steadied. She added a rider crossing the bridge. Tiny, no more than a sliver of thread. Then a tree by the bank, then reeds, then a sliver of sky. Each night when the candle burned low, she worked by firelight, the flicker of flame guiding her needle, and as the scene emerged in thread, she realized what she had been building. Not just a landscape, a memory, a hope, a path, a way out. It was not escape she dreamed of. It was return. Not to court, perhaps. Not to the throne room or the banquet hall or the scripts of ceremony, but to herself, as she was before the title consumed her, before she learned to speak in mirrors and move like marble. There were rumors she heard through the steward that the king's health was declining. Whispers of coughing fits, of nights where he failed to rise from bed. A bishop had been sent to stay near him. The court grew restless. Her name had not been spoken, not officially, but in the letters she received from distant allies. There were questions again, quiet ones. Is the queen well? Does she still hold counsel in her heart? Is there anything she needs? She did not ask for favors, nor followers. She only sent back one sentence, carefully inked in her own hand now. Her materials returned after weeks of earned trust. A woman who has endured silence hears the world more clearly than ever before. That winter, snow fell early. It cloaked the roof of the manor, softened the corners of her garden walk, and stilled the river in the mornings. The sky remained white for days at a time. Inside, she kept her fire stoked. Her letters continued. Her embroidery lengthened into a full panel, rolled carefully and hidden beneath her mattress when visitors came. She stitched by candlelight and listened for the wind, because, though no summons had come, she knew, he knew, they would need her again. The letter arrived not with fanfare, but with frost. It came tucked beneath a waxed cloth, the seal smudged by cold fingers, the parchment stiff with the winter air. A courier brought it to her chamber without introduction. His eyes lowered, his boots soaked from travel. He handed it to the steward, who, in turn, placed it carefully on the queen's desk without a word. There it sat, beside her quill and the still warm cup of cinnamon tea, silent and heavy with the weight of something long overdue. She did not open it right away. Instead, she stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the snow drift across the garden. The hedges were no longer visible, buried under white. The fountain had frozen over completely. Even the trees stood silent, skeletal against the pale sky, as if holding their breath along with her. Only the wind moved now, slipping like a thief through the eaves, whispering truths in a voice too old to trace. When she turned back, the parchment waited, unassuming, yet alive. She broke the seal slowly. The wax cracked like brittle bark. The words inside were brief. 5 lines. The king had taken ill. Gravely. The court was disordered. Her son, not yet of age, had been brought to the palace for counsel. There were whispers of foreign interference. She was to return. At once. No apology. No reflection. No acknowledgement of the months she had spent in quiet exile, surrounded by watchful walls and perfumed justifications. Only an invitation masked as an order. Still, she folded the letter with hands that no longer trembled. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel fear. She felt clarity. Later that day, the steward returned with confirmation. A litter had been dispatched to carry her back to the capital. 2 guards would escort her, and the old herald who once carried her name in ceremony would accompany her, not to announce her return, but to manage appearances. The court wanted her presence, but not her narrative. Her arrival would be reframed. A visit, a gesture of support. Being summoned, not restored. She allowed it. Let them say what they must. She knew what she was. That night she did not sleep. She sat beside the fire, her embroidery panel rolled out across her lap, hands moving slowly over the final stitches. The thread passed through the cloth with the same rhythm it always had. But her fingers no longer sewed for comfort or rebellion. They sewed with resolution. In the stitched world she had created, the bridge was complete. A figure stood at its center now. Not large, not crowned, but upright. A woman in a long cloak, facing forward, the wind moving her veil behind her. No one waited on the other side. There were no guards, no trumpets, just the open road, stitched into the cloth like a promise. She folded the panel and placed it inside a leather pouch. It would go with her. The journey began at dawn. The litter was modest, closed on all sides with thick curtains, but warmer than she expected. Straw had been laid across the floor, and a fur-lined cloak was draped over her shoulders before the doors shut. She said little as the horses stirred and the wheels creaked into motion. Outside, the countryside rolled past in gray and white, fields sleeping under snow, streams frozen still in their banks. Villages flickered by, chimneys smoking, children chasing each other with red noses and raw hands. No one waved. No one knew she was passing through. And for once, he preferred it that way. It was only on the 3rd day, when the gates of the capital rose up through the mist like stone guardians, that the air around her changed. The guard stiffened. The herald adjusted his collar. Even the horses seemed to step more carefully, hooves clicking on the stone bridge leading toward the palace walls. Inside the city, there was no procession, no crowds, only the subtle rustle of people parting as her litter passed, a ripple of curiosity beneath cloaks and hoods. Few recognized her. Fewer still dared speak her name. She was returning not as the queen who had ruled feasts and festivals, but as something quieter, stranger, a figure spoken of in corners, stitched together in rumor. She entered the palace through the eastern passage, far from the grand courtyard. Servants waited, bowing low, their eyes quickly averted. A chamber had been prepared, not far from the nursery wing. She was offered rest, a warm meal, and a change of garments. Everything was done with grace, decency, God, but there was no warmth. Still, she nodded, thanked them all, and waited. That evening, as dusk settled over the tiled rooftops and the bells of the cathedral told the hour, she was summoned to the king's chambers. She found him alone, thinner than she remembered, pale. The fire cast soft shadows across his cheekbones, sharper now beneath aging skin. He sat in a high-backed chair, a fur cloak wrapped around his shoulders, his hand resting on a cane that had not been there before. He looked up when she entered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "You came." She studied him in silence, her expression unreadable. And then she replied, just as quietly, "You called." They spoke for an hour, not of apologies, not of exile, not even of what had passed between them all these years. They spoke of their son, of the state of the court, of the nobles who circled like wolves outside the council chamber, of the danger of leaving the throne empty, even briefly. She offered no strategy. She offered presence, the kind that does not shout, but cannot be ignored. When she rose to leave, he reached for her hand, not as husband to wife, but as one monarch to another, acknowledging the weight she still carried. In the days that followed, she did not reclaim her old rooms. She did not host banquets or sit on the throne beside him, but she was seen. She stood beside her son during audiences. She whispered advice in corners of the council chamber. She met ambassadors not with fanfare, but with intelligence. The court did not quite know what to make of her. Was she consort? Regent? Spectre? But it didn't matter. She was herself, no longer watched as a symbol, no longer confined by silence. She had crossed the bridge she had stitched alone, beneath winter skies, in a room meant to forget her. And she had not returned to reclaim power. She had returned to remember what it meant to hold it, on her own terms. The queen had learned long ago that death in court rarely announced itself with a dagger. It arrived more softly beneath silver lids between folds of silk, inside goblets passed with smiles and feasts offered in celebration. Poison was the weapon of the clever, the desperate, the cautious, and in the corridors of royal life, it was never just about killing. It was about erasure. No blade to leave a scar, no scream to echo down the hall, just a pale brow in the morning and a hushed conversation over breakfast. She had been taught to taste carefully. Her nurse, when she was still a child of 10, had taught her which herbs to fear. Monkshood with its lovely blue petals, hemlock with its feathery leaves, the bitter taste of foxglove, the scent of ground laurel hidden in sweetmeats. These names were whispered like curses during her first years at court, tucked between lessons in Latin and etiquette, as if danger were part of a noble woman's vocabulary. Something to recite, but never reveal. By the time she was queen, she had mastered the rituals of caution. She waited 3 full seconds after every dish was placed before her. She took only the 3rd sip from every goblet. Her steward assigned a taster to each meal, usually a quiet young man from a low house, loyal and trembling. She never looked them in the eyes. It made it easier when they disappeared, because some did. She never asked what had happened to the taster who collapsed during the summer feast of her 2nd year. He had gone pale mid-course, staggered from the dais, and vanished behind the drapery. The servants moved quickly. The musicians played louder. The guests were told he had taken ill from spoiled fish. But the queen hadn't touched the fish that night. She had declined it with a smile. The dish had been sent by a visiting countess. That countess never returned. These were the rules of survival that no one wrote down. A queen who lived too long became suspect. A queen who trusted too freely became a story. She watched, listened, remembered. There was power in remembering. Even poison couldn't erase that. Court was warfare with better clothing. You didn't need armies to kill a reputation. Only a look held too long. A word spoken in the wrong chamber. A moment of hesitation when pouring wine. The queen had seen men fall not by swords, but by subtler weapons. Envy disguised as loyalty. Whispers planted like seeds in a gossip's ear. Slow looks shared across the feast table. She moved carefully through all of it. Her gowns were lined with notes, tiny slips of parchment folded and stitched into the hems, passed to her by ladies who pretended to adjust her veil. Her prayers in the chapel were sometimes interrupted by accidental bumps from servants who slipped her information instead of communion. She had learned not to flinch, not to react. Eyes were always watching. She trusted no one fully, not even herself. One autumn, her own physician became a suspect. He had served her for years, faithful, consistent, with the hands of a man who knew the body better than the soul. But then came the headaches, the vertigo, a tightness behind her ribs that would not ease. He said it was age, fatigue, the weight of rule. He gave her tinctures that dulled her senses, left her unsteady. It was the old nurse, long since retired, brought back only by request, who noticed the signs. She took one look at the bottle and hissed between her teeth, "This doesn't quiet the heart, my lady. It slows it." The queen dismissed the physician by sunrise, quietly. No trial, no confrontation, just a note sent to his chamber and his belongings removed by noon. He left the palace with his head held high, and she never saw him again. But for weeks afterward, she drank only water drawn from her personal well, ate only bread baked in her private oven, trusted only the old nurse and a silent girl named Ellen, who had never once met her eyes without blushing. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was vigilance, and vigilance had kept her alive where others had vanished. She remembered them all. The princess who arrived with songs and left with fever, the steward who laughed too loudly, then said too much in his cups, and drowned in the river days later. The bishop who blessed every door frame but choked on cinnamon wine during Lent. All of them gone. None mourned too loudly. That was the other rule. Grief was a signal, and signaling was dangerous. So she smiled, as always, sat tall at every feast, tasted what needed tasting, and left every cup unfinished. She once overheard two young nobles whispering near the garden terrace. "She drinks less wine than a monk," one said, laughing. The other replied, "That's why she still rules." The queen stood behind a trellis, hidden in shadow, and allowed herself the briefest smile. They were right. She ruled because she remembered, and memory, in the quiet wars of court, was the sharpest blade of all. The feasts were never just about food. To the untrained eye, they might have seemed like rituals of merriment. Long tables groaning with roasted meats and honeyed breads, walls lined with flickering torches, musicians drawing delicate songs from stringed instruments, while goblets clinked and laughter echoed beneath vaulted ceilings. But to the queen, a feast was the battlefield disguised, and the dining hall, no matter how fragrant or full, was a chessboard of danger. She never arrived first, nor last. To be first was to expose yourself to scrutiny. To be last was to insult the host. She arrived with precision, after the king, before the countesses, flanked by two ladies whose silence was more valuable than their lineage. Her seat was always the same, at the king's right hand, high above the crowd, beneath a banner stitched with her family's crest. From this vantage, she did not feast. She observed. Her gaze moved as gently as her fork. She noted who spoke to whom, who passed food without eating, who reached for wine more than once in a minute. She watched hands, how they shook, how they gestured. The lips, how they curled, pressed, smirked. The eyes, especially the eyes, they betrayed more than the tongue ever dared. In the early years of her reign, she had tried to enjoy the feasts, to laugh, to taste, to allow herself to believe that a gathering could be what it claimed to be. Celebration. But that illusion had been shattered early. During a spring banquet held in honor of a returning knight, it was supposed to be a victory feast. Venison, dancing, the usual theater. She had lifted her goblet to toast and noticed the steward glance once, then again at the knight's plate. A twitch, barely perceptible, but enough. She watched the knight fall before the second course arrived. He did not cry out. He simply slipped silently into the folds of his robe, his cup falling to the floor, wine and bile mingling in a pool at his feet. The music did not stop. The queen stood quickly, called for help with urgency but not panic. The feast continued. The knight was buried the next day. The steward disappeared 3 weeks later. From that night forward, she trained her tongue as sharply as her ears. She let the food pass her lips, but never fully into her trust. She trained herself to smile while tasting bitterness, to speak while thinking 2 steps ahead. She perfected the art of listening while appearing distracted. A royal pastime, misread by many as disinterest, when in fact it was the most dangerous work of all. For it was during these feasts that plots were seeded, not in speeches but in glances across the table, in the way someone addressed another with too much warmth, in how a gift was given. A cup too ornate, a plate of fruit placed too near. The poison itself rarely sat on the food. It lived in the context, and so she became fluent in the unsaid. When the Duchess of Arling spoke too fondly of the northern borders, the queen noted how her husband's boots were dusted with travel. When the young Baron of Westmere praised her embroidery in a tone that lingered 1 second too long, she knew he had been sent to test her temperament. Once, a high bishop had leaned across the table to offer her a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, and she accepted it with the grace of a queen, even as her pulse quickened. The herb was clean, the message less so. He was reminding her, "We know what you remember." She smiled and placed it beside her plate. She remembered everything, and that was what unnerved them. The nobles who plotted in whispers, who trusted their ambitions to nightfall in port, forgot that the queen had survived not by luck, but by vigilance. She had seen 4 courts rise and fall, 3 seasons of plague, 2 attempted coups, and more marriages of convenience than she could count. She had outlived rivals who once laughed in her face, and she had done it without drawing a blade or raising her voice. She wielded memory like a net, and the court, at every feast, danced willingly into it. Her most powerful weapon was patience. Once, she waited 9 months, 9 full months, before speaking of a comment made during a feast, when a certain count had raised a toast to the next generation of sovereigns and failed to include her son in the gesture. She had smiled that night, laughed even, linked her goblet with his. Then the following spring, when lands were being redistributed after a border dispute, she gently suggested that the count's loyalty be reassessed. The room fell silent. No one asked her why. They had all heard the toast. They had simply hoped she had forgotten, but she never did. Her silence was never emptiness. It was storage. And so, even as she dined in silence, even as she declined the 3rd course, or pretended to admire the carving of a roast peacock's wing, the queen was gathering. Always gathering. At night, back in her chambers, she would change out of her gowns, wash the scent of wine and wax from her skin, and sit beside the hearth with a single candle burning. There, she would recall every detail: who reached for whose shoulder, who placed a hand too firmly on a servant's back, who hesitated before accepting an offered plum. These were not accidents. These were calculations, and she, their only equal. By the time her maids arrived to help her into bed, she had already built a memory map of the evening. Not all of it would matter, but some of it, some tiny thread, might save her life, or someone else. The poison was always present, not always in the wine, sometimes in the smile. The queen had once believed the deadliest poison was something slipped into a goblet. She knew better now. The most effective poison was time. Not the swift, bitter kind that stole breath in a matter of seconds, but the kind that seeped in gradually, word by word, room by room. A soft decay of trust, a slow unraveling of alliances once sewn tightly by oath and blood. It did not need apothecaries or nightshade, only silence, suggestion, and repetition. This poison traveled not in cups, but in conversations. A nobleman at court would mention, quite casually, that the queen had appeared fatigued at the last feast. A lady-in-waiting would comment on how rarely she left her chambers now. A steward, loyal to an upstart cousin, might imply that she refused to eat anything not prepared by her own kitchen. These remarks were rarely written down, never loud, but they settled into the ears of courtiers like dust on a silk mantle. Light, invisible, impossible to fully brush off. By the time rumors reached the queen, they had been polished, whispered, disguised as concern. She seems delicate lately. Does her mind still keep pace with council matters? Perhaps she needs rest, a quiet retreat, just for a season. The first time she heard one of these comments, it came from a visiting noblewoman seated beside her at a feast, her tone sweet, her perfume strong. She had leaned in and said, "Your Grace, I so admire your poise. You remain so calm, even when others suggest your influence is fading." The queen had smiled, lifted her goblet, and replied, "My dear, only the sea appears still before it swallows ships." The noblewoman laughed politely, but her hands trembled when she reached for the bread. Still, the queen had felt the sting of it. They were testing her now, not with blades or poison, but with memory, measuring how much of her past strength remained. How many allies still whispered her name in admiration, not in doubt. The game had shifted. She was no longer the queen of power. She was the queen of recollection. The old lioness, they thought, useful only in legend. But they had misjudged her, because memory was not weakness. Memory was leverage. She knew who had benefited from past favors. She remembered debts that had never been repaid, marriages she had arranged, scandals she had shielded. She carried these histories in silence, waited for the right moment, then reminded the court, softly, privately, as queens do, that she could still call the wind. One winter evening, when a young duke's wife whispered too confidently of succession, the queen sent her a gift the next morning. A pair of gloves, embroidered with the same pattern the woman's mother had once worn to plead for mercy during a land dispute. No note, no explanation, just fabric, memory, stitched into cotton. The woman went quiet for weeks. The queen didn't have to say a word. Still, she felt the weight of watching her legacy fray at the edges, not because she had failed, but because she had lasted. The court had begun to hunger for the new faces, new blood, and in that hunger, the queen's silence became suspicious. Her restraint, unnerving. Power, they believed, should be visible, loud, fast, gilded with motion. But the queen had never believed that. She had always known the deepest power lived beneath the surface, not in proclamations, in patience. And so, she remained steady. Let them whisper. Let them question. Let them plan. She did not react. She observed. And, very quietly, she prepared. Behind closed doors, she began meeting with her son, not during official council, but in the early mornings, when the corridors were still and the world outside was wrapped in frost. She taught him how to recognize false loyalty, how to ask questions that sounded like compliments, how to sit through a lie without blinking, and how to recall every word the moment the liar left the room. These were not lessons of law. These were the lessons of survival. He listened carefully, his hands clasped behind his back like his father used to do. But his eyes belonged to her. Watchful, quiet, thinking always 3 steps ahead. The queen knew her time at the center of things was waning. But she did not fear it. Her reign had never been about the throne itself. It had always been about shaping the shadows. And in that, she had succeeded. She had survived. More than that, she had endured. She had eaten beside men who plotted her death and walked away untouched. She had sipped wine laced with questions and answered with clarity. She had embroidered warnings into altar cloths and buried truths inside poems read aloud during Mass. She had been underestimated. She had been watched. She had been whispered about. And still, she remained. Not in defiance, in design. On the last night of winter, as the stars burned low above the palace and the snow melted into black rivers, she stood alone in the chapel. The torches were low. The air still held the faint scent of frankincense and old wood. She knelt, not to beg, but to remember. She whispered no prayers, only names. Names of those who had tried to poison her, by cup, by rumor, by ambition. Names of those she had forgiven, names of those she had not. Then she stood, wrapped her cloak around her shoulders, and walked through the silent corridor without a guard. Because she needed no one to protect her. Not anymore. She rose before the queen, not by choice, but by training. Before the bells tolled in the courtyard, before the doves stirred in their roosts above the chapel, before even the cook lit the morning hearth, the lady-in-waiting had already bathed, dressed, and tied her dark hair back in the simplest plait allowed by court fashion. Her gown was modest, pale blue trimmed with silver thread, a mark of her station. It bore no emblem, no family crest, no color bold enough to distract, because she was not there to be seen. She was there to reflect, to follow, to serve. The queen would never dress without her, not because she couldn't, but because that was the rule. A queen must never be seen in transition. Her presence, like the dawn itself, must appear fully formed, perfectly laced, veiled, jeweled, composed. And the lady-in-waiting was the ghost behind that illusion, the one who ensured it never faltered. She would enter the royal chamber with lowered eyes, curtsy in silence, and begin the ritual without words, combing the queen's hair, warming the cloths, fastening the stays. She knew the queen's preferences as intimately as a priest knew his scripture, which gown to lay out on fast days, which ring to avoid when her joints ached in winter, how much perfume was acceptable when mourning, and where to press the scent behind her ear without staining the lace. Yet no one would ever speak her name in the hall. She was simply the shadow, and that was how it had always been. She had entered the royal household at 14, her family neither high enough to be noble nor low enough to be forgotten. Her mother had once served the queen's mother, and that quiet legacy had earned her a place. Small, unnoticed, but steady. She had spent her first year in awe of the tapestries, the wax-polished floors, the way people moved like smoke through the corridors. But awe had burned away quickly, replaced by the awareness that in this place, every glance meant something. The queen had chosen her personally, though not in the romantic manner the poets imagined. No drawn-out ceremony, no gilded announcement. Simply a nod one afternoon after prayers, followed by a single command from the chamberlain. You will attend Her Majesty directly from now on. And from then on, she did. She stood behind the queen during meals, her fingers hovering near the cup should it need refilling. She kept pace 3 steps behind during processions, always on the left. She held the queen's gloves while she accepted offerings. She stood beside the queen's chair while she embroidered, not stitching herself but keeping the skeins untangled and the scissors ready. She waited outside the door during private audiences, listening not out of curiosity, but for the pause in conversation that meant tea was needed. She learned quickly that her presence was not about assistance. It was about continuity. A lady-in-waiting was the queen's memory when she was weary, her anchor when the court shifted beneath her feet. The queen might not speak a word to her for days, but her glance was enough. A twitch of the eye meant the conversation had gone too long. A shift in posture meant the nobleman had overstepped. A sigh meant the medicine had not worked. The lady-in-waiting translated these silences into action, seamlessly, invisibly, and she kept her own silence in return. She saw more than most. She saw the queen on mornings when her eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness. Yet still, she rose to greet the court with a smile. She saw the letters passed in firelight, hands trembling, lips pressed tight. She saw the moment a messenger's whispered words made the queen go still, the kind of stillness that only came when someone's life had just ended. She saw the queen break a hairpin once, quietly, beneath the table, the shards digging into her palm until a drop of blood surfaced. Proof that even the most poised hands could hurt when forced to hold back too much. But the lady-in-waiting told no one. Not the other ladies. Not the steward. Not even the confessor. She carried the queen's private burdens like folded linen in her arms, neatly pressed, hidden, heavier than they appeared. She knew her place. Yet sometimes, in moments of stillness, she allowed herself a thought that felt close to longing. She did not envy the crown. Never that. But she wondered what it felt like to be seen the way the queen was. By everyone. Always. Even when she did not wish to be. The weight of it seemed unbearable. And yet the queen wore it without slipping. That alone, the lady thought, was a kind of power no title could grant. Once, during a stormy evening when the queen had dismissed everyone from her chamber but her, the silence between them shifted. The fire snapped loudly in the hearth. Rain tapped against the window like fingers. The queen sat before her mirror, hair unpinned, crown resting on the dressing table like a burden finally laid down. And without turning, she said, "Do you think they see me?" The lady hesitated. "They see the idea of you," she answered. The queen smiled faintly, her reflection flickering in the glass. "And you?" "I see the woman." That was the last time they spoke like that. The moment passed, filed away like a ribbon pressed between pages of a forgotten book. But it changed something unspoken. After that, when the queen rose from her prayers or sat alone in the garden, her eyes searched for the one face among the many that saw her without ceremony. The shadow had become something more. But even that role required silence, because to serve the queen was not to befriend her. It was to witness her. And when the court shifted, when loyalties frayed, and new ladies were brought in from far provinces, younger and more polished, the queen kept her close. Others speculated, wondered aloud why the queen trusted her so completely. They did not understand that trust was not built through words, but through years of quiet presence, through knowing when to disappear, through staying 2 steps behind, through carrying every secret, every sorrow, every pinned veil and trembling breath, and never once letting it fall. The other ladies whispered often, though rarely in front of her. They were courteous, of course. Courtesy was the law behind every word in the palace. But there was always a certain tilt of the head when she entered a room, a pause in the rhythm of the conversation, a softness to the way they greeted her that spoke not of affection, but of distance. She was not one of them, not entirely. She had been with the Queen longer than any of them. She had been there before their marriages, before their titles, before their embroidered sleeves marked them as wives of men, with lands and names that mattered. They saw her as part of the furniture of the Queen's world, no more and no less. A fixture that listened too well. But they had never held the Queen's hair back as she vomited from fever, never knelt beside her when she learned of her sister's death. So sudden, so distant, a messenger's words more cruel than any blade. They had never stood guard at the Queen's door during the long nights after childbirth, when the chamber still smelled of blood and sweat and ash from the candles burned low in prayer. They had never watched the Queen grieve with her hands, embroidering with such focus that the cloth trembled beneath the needle, as if the thread itself bore her sorrow. She had, and she never forgot any of it. In the quietest parts of the day, after the Queen's hair had been combed, and her slippers placed just so at the edge of the bed, when the Queen rested or read in silence, the lady-in-waiting would sit by the open window in the adjoining chamber. She would polish the Queen's rings one by one, using a scrap of old velvet that smelled faintly of lavender. It was a task no one had assigned to her, one that could have been given to any chambermaid. But she took it upon herself because she understood. These rings were not just ornaments. They were memory. Each one had a story. One, a gift from a child the Queen had outlived. Another, inherited from a mother whose portrait hung above the chapel stairs. One had belonged to a foreign king's sister, given as part of a treaty, never worn in public, but always kept nearby. These were things the court never saw. They saw the Queen as adorned, never as attached. They saw gowns and gestures, not moments. They never noticed the way the Queen touched the edge of her veil when speaking of home, or how her fingers curled slightly when a certain name was spoken in council. They did not know her tells, but the lady-in-waiting did. And with that knowledge came a strange sort of power. Not the power to command, but the power to understand. And sometimes, understanding was the only thing that mattered. One afternoon, during a feast held in honor of a visiting ambassador, a platter of sweetmeats had arrived at the Queen's table. The desserts were small, golden, shaped like birds, filled with almonds and honey, a delicate gift from the eastern provinces. The Queen reached for one, slowly, her eyes scanning the table. She hesitated for just a breath, not long enough for anyone to notice, except her. From her post behind the Queen's chair, the lady-in-waiting stepped forward, gently adjusted a fold in the Queen's sleeve, and whispered low enough for no one else to hear. That dish was also served last winter, after Lord Carden's visit. The Queen paused, withdrew her hand, and smiled. "Ah," she said aloud. "I believe I'll try the lemon tart instead." The conversation continued. The music did not falter, but the message was clear. Whatever was in that dish, whatever memory or warning it carried, had been quietly intercepted. There was no praise for the act, no nod of recognition, only the continued unfolding of the evening. But later, as the Queen sat at her dressing table, removing her earrings one by one, she looked into the mirror, not at herself, but at the woman behind her, and she said simply, "You remember the things I forget." It was the highest compliment ever paid to her, and it was never spoken again, because the greatest truths between them were never repeated. They existed in the space between actions. The way the Queen reached for her hand during a moment of weakness, or how the lady-in-waiting folded her cloak before she asked. Their entire relationship was built on things unsaid, which made the pain of what was coming all the sharper. Because shadows, no matter how faithful, are not meant to stay forever. They fade as the sun moves. And in recent months, the sun had begun to move swiftly. New faces filled the court. Younger women with practiced smiles and perfect posture. The queen's son had taken more authority, and with his new wife came a new household. Fresh voices, fresh energy. The queen, though still respected, had begun to step back. Her audiences were shorter, her duties fewer, and the lady-in-waiting knew her time was nearing its quiet end. But there would be no farewell. Not formally. She would not be dismissed, only replaced. She would still be addressed politely in the corridors, still be seated at the queen's left during chapel, still be invited to the feast, though placed 2 chairs further away than before. But she had served long enough to recognize the signs. She did not resent it. She had known from the beginning that her role was not to be eternal. It was to be present, faithfully, silently, attentively, for as long as she was needed. And soon the queen would no longer need her, because the queen too was changing, not weakening, just shifting, becoming something closer to memory herself. And so the lady-in-waiting continued polishing the rings each morning, folding the shawls, laying out the slippers. She continued walking 3 steps behind, continued listening, watching, waiting, because when her time came to fade, she would do it exactly as she had lived. In the background, without sound, without pride, with nothing but grace. The farewell did not come with trumpets. It came with a folded note, placed quietly on her table beside the looking-glass, written in a hand she knew by heart. The queen had not signed it. There was no need. The words were brief, thankful, careful, and final, not in the sense of dismissal but in tone. It was a note written by a woman who understood how things ended at court, gently, without spectacle, the way a candle burns down into its own wax. She read it once, then once more, then folded it slowly and tucked it into the lining of her travel cloak. She had not worn that cloak in years. The morning of her departure passed like any other. She rose before the bells, as she always had. She brushed her own hair this time. Slowly, methodically, her fingers stiff from years of service. Her gown was modest, a deep green that matched her eyes. She did not wear her best jewelry. This wasn't an event. It was simply a day, one that had taken a lifetime to arrive. She took her time packing, not because there was much to take. Her possessions were few, but because she was tracing the years as she touched each item. The pen the queen had once lent her when her own had snapped. The prayer book passed to her by a former lady who had died one winter, and whose name no one now mentioned. A length of lace from a gown long outgrown, pressed between pages of an old psalter. Each piece held a story, but none worth retelling aloud. They were hers, unshared, unspoken. When her small satchel was finally fastened, she stepped once more into the queen's chamber, not to serve, but simply to see it as it was, for the last time. The queen sat by the window, her posture relaxed, the lines at the corner of her eyes a little deeper than the year before, her hands folded loosely over her lap. The light touched her gently, casting her not in gold, as poets like to imagine, but in a soft, forgiving silver. They said nothing for a long while. The chamber was warm, quiet, gaudy, familiar in that painful, irreplaceable way that only rooms lived in for decades can be. The tapestries had faded. The rug beneath the queen's chair had worn down in the places where her slippers always rested. On the mantel, a single candle burned low, its wick curling like a final breath. The lady-in-waiting did not curtsy. Not this time. She simply walked forward and knelt beside the queen's chair. The queen looked down, her fingers reaching slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair from the woman's temple. Her touch was light, reverent. "You were my mirror," she said softly. "The one that never cracked." It was not flattery. It was recognition. Tears did not fall. That would have broken the spell. Instead, the lady in waiting stood, her back straight, her expression still, and said, "And you were the only light I chose to follow." There were no more words. They had never needed many. As she stepped from the chamber, her shoes making no sound on the stone floor, the silence behind her did not feel empty. It felt full, carried, like the soft closing of a door that had been left open too long. Outside, the courtyard was bright. The trees were in bloom again. Courtiers passed by without stopping. Pages hurried along with scrolls. A jester laughed in the far distance. Life had already moved on. She walked toward the outer gate alone. No procession, no escort, just her, and the weightless echo of every step she had taken behind someone else. She did not turn back. That was not her way. But she would remember the sound of the queen's breathing in the dark, the soft scrape of her comb on the dressing table, the rustle of her gown when she stood too quickly, the delicate sigh she made when pretending not to worry. And in the years that followed, as her hair grayed and her joints stiffened, and no one at the village market knew who she had once been, the lady in waiting would still rise early. She would still fold her hands behind her back when she thought. She would still polish her own rings with a square of velvet that smelled faintly, impossibly, of lavender. She would remain, in every quiet way, a shadow that had once belonged to a queen, but now, at last, belonged only to herself. It began, as such things often did, with silence. Not the ceremonial kind that filled chapels or throne rooms, but a heavier silence, thick with meaning, stretched between the stone walls of the queen's private chamber, broken only by the steady brushing of hooves somewhere in the distance. Outside the fortress, beyond the high curtain wall and the guard posts, the army was already assembling, iron and leather creaking beneath moonlight. Men murmuring to their horses, banners folding gently in the wind. Inside, the queen laced her own riding boots. No maid helped her that morning. No perfumed towel. No jewelry box opened with soft gloved hands. Instead, she moved alone through the space, fastening each buckle, strapping down the edges of her mail, tying her linen beneath her cuirass with fingers that did not shake. Not because she felt brave, but because she had made this decision long before anyone dared to try and stop. War had come, and unlike the queens before her, those who lit candles and waited for messengers to return, who sent suns and watched for omens in tea leaves, this queen had no patience left for waiting. She would ride. They had told her not to. Worse, they had. The king's council had spoken in practiced tones, full of flattery and condescension. "Your presence is better served here, your grace. Within the safety of stone. The men will fight harder if they know you're praying for them. Your duty is to symbolize, not to command." She had listened. Then she had stood and said only, "Symbolism does not bleed. I will." There had been no argument after that. They had not expected her to follow through. Even as the orders were prepared, the guards assigned, the horse saddled and fitted for a woman's seat, they imagined it was all show, some queenly performance designed to stir the hearts of common folk. But she was not the kind of woman who summoned armor for pageantry. She wore no skirt that day, no embroidery, no velvet trimmed with pearls, just steel. Dented, inherited, heavy, it had once belonged to her grandmother. a countess who held a fortress against siege for 12 days without losing a single wall. The queen did not ride side saddle. That, too, had been a choice. She knew how it looked, knew the scribes would fumble for words to describe her, their quills scratching terms like unwomanly bold, unprecedented. But she did not ride for them. She rode because she knew what it meant to be carried into battle like cargo, and she refused to be strapped to someone else's command. The halls were cold as she made her way toward the stables, her boots striking the flagstones with hollow resolve. No trumpets, no herald. The guards who stood at the gates looked away quickly as she passed, not out of shame, but fear. Not of her, of what it meant, because when a queen rode to war, it meant something had broken, something sacred, something the men were meant to protect, but hadn't. When she stepped into the stable yard, the sky had just begun to gray. Frost clung to the saddle. Her horse, black, lean, watchful, stamped once, then turned its head toward her with the quiet recognition of a creature who knew its rider was not afraid to fall. She mounted without help, hands steady, back straight, the sword at her side, not for ceremony but for use. At the gate, a captain waited. He was young, proud, loyal to the crown, but not yet wise enough to know that obedience and loyalty were not always the same thing. "You'll remain behind the front," he said, his breath misting. "The archers will hold the tree line. We'll keep you close to the physician's tent." The queen looked at him. "I will remain where I'm needed. If the line breaks, you'll see me beside it." He swallowed and nodded. He did not argue again. The queen turned her gaze to the horizon. The battlefield lay 2 miles beyond the river, over the rise of a low hill where the grass had already been trampled by scouts and horses. Beyond it, in the thick of the valley, the enemy waited, camped with banners she did not recognize, led by a man who had once called her sister, and now called her rival. This was not a war for land. It was a war for inheritance, for legacy, for the shape of the map that would remain long after she was gone. But beneath all that, it was simpler. It was a war to show that a queen could not be dismissed, simply because she was not a king. The gates opened with a groan. Wind swept through the opening like a summons. The queen tightened the reins and pressed her heels to the horse's flanks. She did not look back. There was no need. She had already said her goodbyes. Not aloud. There hadn't been time, and she would not have allowed herself the softness. But in the way, she had touched the carved edge of her son's crib the night before, her fingertips ghosting over the wood like a blessing. In the way, she had pressed her lips to the banner of her house before tying it to her spear. She had always known this moment would come. Queens were not made for comfort. They were made for thresholds, doorways, decisions, the spaces where power is either stepped into or passed over. And today, she rode into that space, not as a wife, not as a mother, not even as a monarch. She rode as herself, unyielding, unforgiven, unforgotten. By midday, she was among them, no longer apart, no longer above, but riding in the same cold air that chafed every soldier's throat and filled every lung with the bite of coming conflict. The queen's banner trailed behind her, green and gold, threaded with the stitched wings of a falcon in flight. It was a symbol her ancestors had carried into crusades and skirmishes, into halls of diplomacy, and down aisles of coronation. But never like this, never behind a woman clad in steel, whose crown remained locked in a chest at home, and whose every breath fogged against a helmet lined in sweat. The men did not cheer when she arrived. They stared, and in their stares was confusion. then hesitation, and then, quietly, recognition. They had seen kings march before. They had followed princes. They had bent the knee before dukes who stank of wine and fear. But now, they saw something different. The queen did not bark commands. She did not pace or post speeches. She simply rode through the lines, her eyes moving from face to face, from trembling youth to blood-stained veterans. Her presence as still and sharp as the blade at her side. A commander approached her as the wind shifted. He was older, half limping from an old campaign, his jaw unshaved and his eyes rimmed with years of command. His name was Edron. She remembered giving him his first commission. Barely more than a boy then, too proud to ask questions. Now he bowed low, and when he rose, he said softly, "We didn't expect you to come." She studied him. "I was never meant to be expected," she answered, "only obeyed." He blinked, then nodded once. She asked for the map. The two of them walked into the command tent together, where a single wooden table held the sketched outlines of terrain. Ink-blotted rivers, crude trees, red angsies marking vulnerable ground. Her glove creaked as she pointed to the eastern slope. "There," she said. "They all come from the shade. They always do." Edron frowned. "The others think they'll ride directly at the hill." Bean shook her head. "Not if they've been taught by their new master. He doesn't strike. He waits." Her voice carried weight, not just because of rank, but because of how she said it. Plain, certain, without poetry or doubt. She didn't need approval. She needed action. And men obeyed that kind of voice. They always had. Outside the tent, the camp stirred with tension, the sound of sharpening steel, the clink of armor being strapped tight, the rustle of chainmail, cloaks, and nerves. Horses shifted beneath their riders, stamping the frozen grass into muddy impressions. From time to time, someone would glance toward the command tent, toward the outline of a woman behind the canvas, speaking not as figurehead, but as strategist. When she stepped out again, her gauntlets on, her blade sheathed at her hip, the lines had quieted, not out of fear, but reverence. The kind that comes only when a truth has settled in like a stone in water. Quiet, unmovable, certain. She rode to the hilltop where the archers waited. The wind was stronger there, carrying with it the metallic taste of distance and danger. Her horse shifted beneath her, sensing the coming storm. The men stood in rows, eyes toward the tree line. Their commander approached her, but before he could speak, she dismounted, her boots landing with a soft thud in the brittle grass. "I want the first volley staggered," she said. "Not all at once. Let them step into the second wave." He hesitated. "That's not standard, Your Majesty." She turned to him. "Neither is your queen standing here." That was the last moment of stillness before it began. Because war, when it finally arrives, does not announce itself with horns or fire. It begins like a breath caught too long in the chest, a twitch in the trees, the cry of a hawk circling above the smoke. Then, suddenly, a shiver across the lines, a glint of sunlight off metal, the sound of hooves like thunder rolling in. The enemy crested the hill opposite them, banners flaring, shields bristling, cavalry churning the frozen earth. They were not strangers. She had broken bread with some of their leaders long ago, when peace still seemed possible. But peace was not profitable to them anymore. Not when her son was young and the throne vulnerable. Not when they believed a woman's voice could be silenced by a well-timed strike. And now they would learn otherwise. She did not ride into the center. That was not her place. She rode along the flank, just behind the archers, where the command was given to fire and falter. She watched every volley, eyes narrowing with each retreat and regroup. When the enemy advanced too quickly on the west, she sent Edrin and his second line of spearmen. When a young rider broke formation in panic, she caught his reins herself and turned him back with a single look. She did not scream orders. She moved like memory, like every tale those men had ever heard of a woman who waited too long to be heard. And when she finally spoke, nations listened. The first break in the enemy lines came just after the sun reached its peak. The queen stood atop the ridge, face streaked with dirt and sweat, her cloak billowing behind her like a second flag. Below, the field was a chaos of motion. Horses down, soldiers staggering, the clang of steel on steel. But above it all, her banner still waved, and her voice still rose, steady as a drumbeat. Old reform. Now. And when the enemy faltered, when their captain fell and their line cracked open like a frozen lake underfoot, she did not cheer. She only watched and waited, because wars were not won in charges. They were won in the stillness between. And that, more than anything, was what made her dangerous. The battle was over long before the shouting stopped. Smoke lingered in the valley like mist, clinging to a bad dream, curling around broken lances, shattered shields, and the uneven breathing of men who had seen too much and spoken too little. Crows circled overhead, already beginning the work they were born to do. The air was thick with blood and trampled earth, and somewhere in the distance, a dying horse shrieked into the open sky. But amid the ruin, one banner remained upright. It was hers. The queen sat atop her horse again by the time dusk began to creep across the field. Her cloak was stiff with dried mud. A gash ran along the side of her gauntlet. Not deep, but enough to have drawn blood. A line of red that had already dried brown. She did not feel it. Not yet. The body quiets its pain when the mind is still braced for what might come next. Victory was never loud in her mind. It was a stillness. She looked across the field, her jaw set, eyes heavy. Survivors were gathering in uneven clusters. Some prayed, others sat with their heads bowed. A few wept, not from wounds, but from the release of having lived. She did not interrupt them. This was not the time for command. This was the time for remembrance. When her captains approached, voices low and faces worn, she heard only fragments, mentions of flanks that had held, arrows that had fallen short, men who had stood where they shouldn't and still hadn't broke. There would be reports later, dallying, letters sent, rewards, burials, punishments, all of it to be arranged like furniture after a storm. But for now, she only nodded. Her work here, the work they feared she wouldn't do, was finished. By the time she turned her horse back toward the hills, the sky was bruised with evening. Her soldiers followed, not in formation, not in triumph, but in quiet steps, the kind that come from having seen death and made bargains with it. The queen said nothing as they rode. Her eyes stayed ahead, but the men around her rode straighter. They carried themselves not with pride, but with purpose. She had given them something they didn't yet know how to name. It was not courage. It was proof. Proof that leadership did not come from blood alone, or gender, or God's blessing written in some forgotten tome. It came from the act itself, the standing, the staying, the speaking when silence was expected. And she had done all of it. When the party reached the castle gates 2 days later, there were no trumpets, no crowds, no petals scattered on the ground. This was not the kind of victory the court liked to celebrate. It had been a necessary battle, not a glorious one. The threat had been internal, the rebellion inconvenient, the enemy once familiar, There would be no songs written for it. No murals painted in triumph. Only silence, reports, records. Still, the queen dismounted at the same gate she had passed through days earlier, her limbs stiff, her hair tangled and wind-battered. She walked through the halls, not as the woman who embroidered beside the fire, not as the patron of cathedrals or the mother of a young heir. She walked like a returning general. No one greeted her, not at first. Only when she reached the inner courtyard did a single voice call her name. Not Your Majesty, not Queen, but her name. As she had heard it before all this, before the war, before the throne. It was her son. He stood at the far side of the stone walkway, hands clasped, not yet tall enough to fill his own armor, but watching her with a kind of awe he didn't try to hide. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something deeper, understanding. She stopped in front of him, removed her glove, and touched his cheek. "You watched the walls?" she asked. He nodded. "I watched the hill," he replied. "I saw the banner." She didn't speak, didn't need to. He saw her, and that was enough. Later, when the council met again and the war was marked closed and the court began to move back into its patterns, feasts resumed, letters sent, marriages arranged. She sat at the table in silence, her hands folded in her lap. They still underestimated her. Some because they had to. Some because they needed to believe that her ride had been luck. That her choices had been approved by others. That her presence in armor had been symbolic. That it had all been managed by men. She let them believe what they wanted, because she no longer needed to be believed. She had done what queens were never asked to do. She had led in blood. She had disobeyed without faltering. She had returned, not with stories, but with scars. And as she sat beneath the chandelier of council firelight, her armor traded again for silk, her voice quiet but her presence louder than ever, she thought. Let them forget what I did, because one day, their daughters will remember. The first time she was crowned, it wasn't by her husband. It was by a bishop, hands trembling slightly as he placed the circlet of gold upon her head, speaking not in the language of the people, but in Latin, dense and holy, echoed through the cold stone of the cathedral. The incense was so thick she could hardly breathe. Candles blazed in rows like battalions of light. She could feel the press of hundreds of eyes behind her, but she was told to look only forward, only toward the altar, toward the cross. It was not her throne that was being acknowledged that day. It was her sanctity, or at least the appearance of it. A queen's crown was not forged solely by politics or lineage. It was annealed in scripture, in ritual, in the sharp, invisible framework of divine expectation. She was no longer just a woman, or even a consort. She was now the anointed helpmate, the chosen vessel, the sacred mother of a kingdom. She must pretend to understand as if she had built it with her own hands. She was, from that moment on, expected to live closer to God than those around her, to be obedient, pious, measured in all things, especially when wronged, especially when afraid, especially when unseen. The robes she wore during the ceremony were lined with fur and embroidered with threads dipped in real gold. But she did not feel powerful. She felt like an offering, a sacrifice dressed as salvation. No one told her how often she would be expected to kneel after that. Kneel in the chapel each morning before the court was awake. Kneel during special feast days, her knees bruising against stone as sermons dragged on for hours. Kneel beside her husband before bed, even when they had not spoken in days. Her faith was not hers alone. It was public, performative, watched and weighed. Her hands were kissed not out of affection, but out of tradition. Her prayers were heard not by heaven, but by the court's scribes, who took note of which saints she favored and which psalms she recited most often. If she wept during Mass, it was recorded. If she missed morning prayers, it was whispered about in cloisters and corridors. Every sign of devotion, or lack thereof, was interpreted as a window into the moral state of the crown. And yet, despite all this holiness draped across her shoulders, the queen learned quickly that she was not sacred. Not really. Sacred things are protected. She was not. She had been promised that her place beside the king was a gift from God, that her womb was blessed, that her tongue was meant to speak only wisdom, scripture, and grace. But when the king grew cold, they said she must be more patient. When she failed to produce a son, they said she must pray harder. When her counsel was dismissed in court, they said it was not her place. And when she cried in the darkness of her chamber, she said nothing at all, because God too was watching. Her confessor told her that suffering purified the soul. He said that queens must suffer more than most because they bore the weight of nations. She wanted to ask him where that was written. She didn't. Instead, she fasted on feast days and holy days, and days that were nothing at all. She fasted until her head rang with hymns, until her body ached and her vision blurred. She denied herself sweets, wine, meat, comfort, not out of vanity, but out of obligation. The people expected their queen to suffer for them, even if they never saw it. Her body was a vessel for other people's sins, and yet, in secret, she sometimes broke the rules. She would slip into the chapel at night, barefoot, wrapped in a plain shawl, and sit not at the front, where queens were meant to pray, but at the back, among the shadows, where no one could see her mouth move. There, she prayed her own prayers, not for sons, not for her husband, not for the kingdom, but for clarity, for truth, for permission to be a woman before being a symbol. Once, during a pilgrim, she knelt on the stones of an old monastery. Miles from any town, wind cutting through her cloak like knives. The monks bowed to her, fed her broth, offered her straw to sleep on. They praised her humility. They wept at her piety. But none of them asked her if she believed. They assumed, because belief, like obedience, was expected. She did believe, though not always in the way they wanted. She believed in justice, in the mystery of mercy, in the sound of rain against stained glass. She believed that not all wounds healed in prayer, and that silence sometimes carried more truth than sermons. She believed that women, like men, could hold the divine, not as vessels, but as flames. And above all, she believed that holiness did not require her to be erased. It took her years to learn that. Years of bowing and smiling and lighting candles for children who would never be born, for husbands who would never understand her, for a future she would never fully touch. But when she finally did learn it, when the weight of the saint's eyes lifted from her back and she began to speak in her own tongue again, she became something new. Not just a queen, not just a believer, but a soul, unpinned, unashamed. The Queen's chapel was never truly hers. It was built for her, certainly, designed with vaulted ceilings that mimicked the ribs of a ship, a golden crucifix set behind the altar, and frescoes of saints and martyrs that looked down with solemn eyes. The floors were swept each morning by unseen hands. The candles were replaced before they burned too low. Her cushion, where she knelt to pray, was embroidered with her initials, and her book of hours sat on a carved shelf lined with velvet. But still, it did not belong to her, because nothing sacred ever truly did. She was allowed to sit there, to weep there, to whisper her pleas beneath the silence of the vaulted stone. But the space answered not to her breath, nor her heart. It belonged to the church, to the whispers of clerics and confessors who watched her every expression like hawks weighing clouds. She was holy by proximity, never by control, and she knew it. The queen had long understood that she was more revered than respected. When she entered the chapel, veiled and robed, the priests bowed. The court ladies folded their hands. Choir boys froze mid-note. Yet she also knew that outside those candlelit walls, the same priests questioned her sincerity behind closed doors. If she cried too openly at Mass, they praised her sensitivity. If she remained still and unreadable, they whispered that her soul was cold. There was no right way to be holy, only approved ways. When her daughter fell ill in winter and was laid on linen with ice on her forehead, the queen prayed for 7 nights. She didn't eat. She didn't speak. She simply stayed, knelt at the foot of the chapel, her fingers curled tightly around the fraying spine of her psalter. The priest saw her there, shadowed by candlelight, a marble figure draped in wool and silence. On the 8th night, the child died, and not one priest blamed God. They blamed her. They whispered that she must have sinned, that God's wrath had passed through the house because she had lost faith, or had dared to question, or had once said too little when she should have said more. One bishop suggested, delicately, that the queen should make an offering of penance, a new altar, a donation, a fast longer than any she had done before. She complied. Not because she believed them, but because refusing would have fed their power. It had always been like that. When she was first married, she had been paraded through abbeys like a relic, made to kneel for hours as monks pressed their blessings onto her head like weights. She was expected to weep in the right places, smile in others, know the saints by name and the scriptures by heart. And she had done it all, out of survival, not conviction. Her faith had never been for them. It was private, raw, inconvenient. She believed in God, yes, but not the one who lived in ivory towers and scowled through stained glass. She believed in the God who sat beside her when no one else would, in the one who did not need incense or Gregorian chants to hear pain, in the one who dwelled in stillness, in the creak of old pews, in the way her thumb brushed the corner of her prayer book without realizing it. Once, she met a young priest who asked her what she feared most. She had replied being remembered as a statue. He had laughed, unsure if she meant it. But she did, because the holier they made her in public, the less human they allowed her to be in private. They wanted her to shine, not to ache, to kneel, but never to fall, to pray, but never to question. And yet, she did all of these. She had once spoken too honestly during a sermon, remarking that grief often made her feel abandoned by heaven. The bishop's face had gone pale. The scribes had looked up from their scrolls. That passage had been cut from the records. Her words never repeated. But she remembered them. And so did the chapel. Each morning, she would return to that same pew, where her fingertips had once dug into the wood, as if trying to anchor herself to something solid, something unmoving in a world that expected her to float gracefully above suffering. She stayed grounded. She stayed faithful. But it was not a faith shaped by priests. It was not meek. It was forged in quiet defiance, in the way she chose which saints to light candles for, in the prayers she recited in languages not written down. In the silences she carried between her ribs like relics of her own. When pilgrims passed through the palace gates, they asked to see her chapel. They did not ask to see her, but she heard them speak her name with reverence, as if she had become part of the structure. The stone, the glass, the story. It should have frightened her, to be canonized while still living. But instead, it made her smile, because she knew they did not see the full truth. They saw the veil, not the eyes beneath it. They saw the crown at the altar, but not the woman who wore it. And that woman, flesh and breath, flawed and unwavering, was far more dangerous than the version they prayed toward. There was a time, not long ago, when they began to speak of her as if she were no longer alive. Not in the literal sense. Her body still walked the stone corridors, still sat in the chapel pews each morning, still dipped her fingers in the holy water before every procession. But in the mouths of the scribes, in the sermons delivered at court, in the careful whispers of noble women, her had been lifted out of the world and placed delicately on a pedestal. They called her the most blessed mother of the realm. They called her the quiet light. They compared her to saints who had died with clean hands and locked lips. They spoke as if she had stopped being a woman and become something else. Something carved, distant, devotional. At first, she had said nothing. It was easier that way. Easier to let them canonize her in life than fight against the very they had created for her. A saint could not argue, after all. A saint did not protest when her words were edited, her decisions questioned, her body placed in places she had not chosen. A saint suffered beautifully and let others draw meaning from it. But the queen, who had lived through war and childbirth and betrayal and endless vigils, had never suffered beautifully. She had suffered honestly. She began to feel the weight of it most keenly during feast days, when the cathedral swelled with choirs and perfume, when gold-threaded vestments glittered under the high windows, and her name was spoken from the pulpit as if she had descended from a heavenly realm, rather than stepped carefully into her seat with aching knees and a heart full of exhaustion. The people would bow their heads as her name was spoken aloud. May the Queen's righteousness guide our households. May her example be as the Virgin's. May she live always in the Lord's quiet. But no one ever asked her if she wanted that kind of silence. No one ever asked if the Virgin, too, had days where she wanted to scream. She kept her face composed. Always. She bowed when expected, crossed herself with grace. But inside her, something old and restless stirred, because she had not lived a life free of sin or struggle. She had loved imperfectly. She had doubted. She had envied other women their freedom. She had wanted things that could never be named at the altar. And she had prayed not with clean words, but with trembling ones. Late at night, alone in her chamber, she would whisper prayers with no structure. Prayers stitched out of sorrow and memory. She would speak aloud to no one. Am I good because they say so, or because I choose to be? No answer came, but she kept asking. As the years pressed on, her place in the court became ever more ceremonial. Her presence was used to consecrate harvests, bless marriages, smile at orphans and sick children, whose names she would never be allowed to remember. When conflict arose between noble houses, they came to her not for judgment, but for endorsement. A queen's blessing could calm tempers. Her nod could seal a treaty. She was no longer expected to think, only to sanctify. And still, they praised her for her piety. She is so devoted. She is like stone, unmoved, eternal. But she was moved, quietly, deeply, in the moments no one saw. She was moved when a peasant girl sang at Mass with a voice that cracked mid-hymn from hunger, and the bishop said nothing. She was moved when she passed the relic chamber and saw the bones of a long-dead saint locked in glass while the bones of forgotten women lay in unmarked graves. She was moved when her own maid miscarried in silence and had to return to combing her mistress' hair as if nothing had shifted within her. It was then the queen began to change. Subtly, slowly, without spectacle. She still attended chapel, still prayed, still touched her lips to the cross. But she began to select the readings herself. She asked for scripture in the language of the people, not in Latin. She instructed her ladies to carry candles not only for noble souls, but for the nameless, the mothers who died giving birth alone. The girls sent to abbés not for calling, but for silence. She replaced the saint's tapestry above the altar with one she had embroidered herself. Not a martyr, not a virgin, but a kneeling woman with her face lifted to heaven, unsaintly, unholy, and unapologetically human. They called it bold. They called it dangerous. The bishop said it lacked tradition. She said, so did the resurrection. They did not remove the tapestry. They did not dare. And slowly, quietly, something shifted. Women who had once looked to her with reverence began to look with recognition. A young noblewoman caught her eye during Vespers and did not look away. An old washerwoman curtsied and whispered, "Thank you," though the queen had not yet spoken that day. And her son, now grown, paused during a council meeting and said, "Mother, what would you do?" With no irony, no performative politeness, just truth. She had never asked to be holy. She had only ever asked to be real. And now, at last, the two things did not seem so far apart. On her final feast day as queen, the cathedral was full. Candles flickered down every aisle. The choir sang her name again, this time paired with a psalm she had chosen herself. One about a woman who plants vineyards, who girds herself with strength, who speaks with wisdom and laughs without fear of the future. The people bowed their heads, but the queen kept hers lifted. She did not cry. She did not kneel. She simply stood there, in the full weight of her years, wearing no crown, only a cloak, and the peace of someone who no longer needed to be revered, only remembered, properly, truthfully, as she really was. The gown was beautiful. There was never any question about that. It shimmered like water beneath torchlight, the blue silk shifting as she walked, as if waves followed her through the corridors. Tiny silver threads ran along the hem, catching the light with every step. The sleeves fanned wide at the wrists, trailing just enough to make a whispering sound as they brushed against the polished stone floor. It had been made by the finest seamstresses in the capital, using fabric imported from across 3 seas, dyed with crushed wad and overlaid with translucent linen, so fine it could pass through the eye of a needle. But as the queen stood before the mirror, the bodice being laced tighter and tighter by the fingers of 2 determined ladies, all she could think about was how hard it was to breathe. She didn't show it. Her training had been too thorough for that. She held still, arms slightly lifted, jaw relaxed, her eyes fixed not on her reflection, but on the center of her own forehead, learning long ago that if you focused there, you wouldn't flinch. Behind her, the maids murmured to each other about the upcoming feast, how the room would be lit entirely by beeswax candles, how the imported sugar would be shaped into swans, how the queen's presence would be the crown atop it all. But none of them spoke of the pain. They never did, because pain was part of the garment, as much as the thread, as much as the pearl work. Beauty for a queen was not soft. It was structured, constricted, performed. The gown had been chosen not for her comfort but for the court's gaze. It was wide where it needed to catch the eye, narrow where it needed to impress the imagination. The neckline was cut low enough to hint at softness, but not so low as to suggest intimacy. The back was straight and stiff, the sleeves impractical, the weight of the skirts enough to force her steps into a glide rather than a walk. It had taken 4 women to lift it onto her, and now it would take 4 hours to survive inside it. She had worn armor lighter than this, and in many ways, armor had been more honest. Armor was meant to protect. This gown was meant to display. It was not the first time she had felt like an exhibit within her own body. From the moment she arrived at court, a girl of barely 16, her garments had spoken before she did. Her sleeves were studied more carefully than her words. Her veil length was debated by women who had never spoken to her. Once, a nobleman had said her embroidered belt was a work of art. He had not remembered what she said to him moments later. So she learned quickly. Fabric was power, but it was also prison. Her day was stitched in layers. Morning in damask, afternoon in satin, evening in velvet lined with fox fur, unless fasting, in which case she wore undyed linen, so the world could admire her piety even in how she suffered against the cold. Every thread bore meaning. Colors were coded in ways the uninitiated would never guess. Pale blue meant reconciliation. Burgundy marked remembrance. Gold meant fertility. And black, worn outside of mourning, was a whisper of protest. The queen had worn black once when her voice was ignored in council. No one had dared comment on it aloud. But the king's chamberlain spent the entire next week sending her gifts, as if silk could buy back silence. But it couldn't. The seams still bit into her sides. The laces still bruised her ribs. The shoes, made to match the gown, pinched at her toes until she lost all feeling in them before the feast was half over. And she still smiled, because queens didn't limp. They glided. And if they bled inside their gowns, the fabric absorbed it, and no one ever saw. She remembered once seeing a servant girl weep while carrying her outer cloak. It was heavy, lined in fur, too large for a girl of her size, and she had tripped, nearly falling onto the tiles. The queen had reached for her, steadied her, and asked her name. The girl had blinked through tears and whispered, "Ellen," before returning to her place in silence. Later, one of the senior ladies-in-waiting had scolded her for drawing attention. "Even kindness must be measured, your grace," she had said. "A queen's compassion must never wrinkle the wrinkles." Even compassion was measured in creases. By the time the feast began that evening, the queen's body was aching. Her gown shone like a star among the torchlight. Her crown had been adjusted twice. The pearls at her throat itched, but she did not move. The hall was filled with the scent of roasted game and rosewater. Music rose from the minstrel's corner, soft and practiced. And she sat there, a perfect sculpture. They said later she looked radiant. No one asked how long she stood in cold air while waiting to be presented. No one asked how tightly the girdle had been drawn. No one noticed the bruises the sleeves left on her wrists. They remembered only the shimmer and the silence, because the gown had done its job. It had made her unforgettable, at the cost of breath. At the cost of pain, at the cost of herself. There were mornings she hated the dressing chamber, not for its cold, which settled into the stone floor long before sunrise, nor for the endless fittings that started before she had eaten, nor even for the hands, so many hands, pulling, pinning, tucking, tightening, adjusting. No. What she hated most was that the room belonged to everyone but her. Her body, when inside it was not hers. It was a canvas, a vessel, a mannequin with a pulse. The seamstresses, always polite, spoke of her figure in the third person, as if she couldn't hear them. She's thinner across the shoulders this month. Her waist has held its shape longer than expected. We'll need to lower the hem again. Her posture's straighter than it was last year, and she stood there, arms slightly raised, as they turned her into a message. Every dress was a sentence. Every color, every fabric, every embroidery motif was a phrase in the long, unspoken letter that was her public. If her husband was negotiating trade with the East, she would wear damask with a stitched border of almond blossoms, symbols of peace and fertility. If there had been a death in the court, she wore charcoal gray, mourning without misery. If a rival duchess arrived from another kingdom, she would wear velvet so dark and gleaming it reflected nothing at all. Her fashion was diplomacy, and it came at a cost. She had worn gowns so stiff with corsetry that she could not sit, so delicate in sleeve that she dared not lift a spoon. She had worn veils so long she couldn't turn her head, and bodices so tight her heartbeat felt distant, trapped beneath layers of whalebone and cloth of gold. She had fainted once, just once, in public during the Feast of the Holy Ascension, her gown laced so tightly she could barely whisper the psalm. She had dropped her chalice, and when she came to, her maids had blamed the heat, the excitement, the incense. No one had dared say the truth. The dress had been too perfect, too heavy, too much, and no one had questioned it, because queens weren't supposed to crumble beneath silk. They were supposed to glide across marble like saints painted in stained glass, breathtaking and immobile. But she was not glass. She bruised. She sweated. She bled through her undergarments during long ceremonies and prayed that the linen would absorb it before it touched the satin. She developed red rashes along her collarbone from the pearl sewn too tightly to her neckline. Once, in winter, her sleeves froze from melted snow, and she spent the rest of the night shivering beneath a fur stole so heavy she could barely lift her arms. And still they said she looked divine. She learned eventually to weaponize that illusion. If they would turn her into a painting, she would choose the brushstrokes. She began requesting certain fabrics, not for comfort, but for control. She had a cloak made of thistle-colored wool, scratchy and odd, which she wore during negotiations with barons she disliked. She added an embroidered fox into the hem of her spring gown, knowing the court poet would see it and whisper it meant cunning. She once wore a dress of deepest indigo, knowing full well it would be mistaken for mourning. By the end of the feast, 5 lords had asked her whom she had lost. She said, "That depends on how you define loss." They stopped asking questions. Her dresses began speaking louder than her speeches, and that, she realized, was the trick. When you are not allowed to yell, wear it instead. She had a winter gown made with a lining of chainmail. No one knew, but she felt it, felt the weight of it against her spine, the cool press of metal across her ribs. She stood taller in it, firmer, tendrer, and during the long negotiations about her son's marriage alliance, she wore it without pause. She won that argument. There were limits, of course. She could never wear trousers, never go uncorseted, never arrive in the great hall without her hair braided in the correct pattern for her rank. But within those rules she carved freedom, just enough to remind herself that she still existed beneath the layers, that the silk did not own her, because it almost had. She remembered a night, years ago now, when she had removed her gown after a banquet, peeled away from it like skin from bone, and sat on the edge of her bed in nothing but her shift, staring at the bruises along her ribs. She She had looked down at her body, not with shame, but with distance, like it belonged to someone else. And in that moment, she realized she was tired of dressing for everyone else's idea of royalty. She still dressed for them. She had no choice. But now, every gown carried a thread of rebellion, a stitch placed out of pattern, a lining sewn in defiance, a message they would never understand. But she would, and that was enough. She had worn thousands of gowns by then. Some she remembered for the way they caught firelight in the great hall, some for the blisters they left behind. But the gown she remembered most was the one she chose entirely for herself. It was late spring when she first asked for it. Not with ceremony or announcement. Just a quiet request passed to the seamstress, as the palace buzzed with preparations for yet another wedding feast, another foreign envoy, another day of her presence being requested, but her voice being optional. She asked for a dress of plain wool, soft and unbleached. No embroidery, no train, no lacing so tight it stole the breath. A shift, loose and natural, stitched not for spectacle but for solitude. The seamstress had paused, just slightly, before nodding. No one questioned the order. It wasn't recorded in the wardrobe books. It never appeared in the royal inventory. But 2 weeks later, folded inside a basket of scented linens, it arrived. She ran her hands across the fabric in silence. It was light, warm, honest. It reminded her of her girlhood, of walking through meadows behind the convent in weathered boots, of stealing mulberries with her cousins and laughing with a mouth full of purple. She didn't wear it in court, not in front of anyone, but on the morning of her 50th year, long before the bells rang for mass and the palace halls filled with motion, she rose quietly, dismissed her attendants, and slipped into that dress. No corset, no jewels, no cloak of state. Her hair, long silver now, she brushed herself and left unbound, falling over her shoulders like the pages of an unwritten book. She stepped barefoot into the garden before the sun fully rose. The stones beneath her feet were cool and uneven. The air still smelled of earth and early roses. No one saw her. That was the point. She walked slowly, letting the wind pass through the loose sleeves. The hem brushed dew from the grass. And for the first time in decades, she felt like herself. Not the woman sewn into public memory, but the girl who once dreamed of being more than decorative, more than dutiful. She sat beneath a tree that had been planted the year her daughter died. It was tall now, quiet, reaching upward, as if still trying to grow past the weight of its roots. She touched its bark and whispered the child's name. Not aloud, not in grief, but in thanks, because grief too had become something she wore. Not on her sleeve, but beneath it. Later that morning, when she returned to her chamber, she folded the dress carefully and placed it in the back of the wardrobe, behind the ceremonial gowns and velvet cloaks and perfumed veils. She did not need to wear it again. It had already done its work. It had reminded her that she was not born in brocade. She had been born naked, loud, kicking. A daughter of a woman who knew how to work a garden and raise 6 children without silk between her fingers. Her strength had not come from satin. It had come from surviving despite it. She thought often of the girls who would come after her. The ones just now being measured for their first court gowns, their waistlines traced by cold fingers, their value spoken of in color palettes and sleeve styles. They would be told to stand tall, to smile gently, to wear their elegance like armor. She hoped one day they would also be told the truth, that no matter how fine the stitching, a dress could never carry a woman. Only a woman could carry the dress, and the finest ones, she now believed, were made to be lived in, not just looked at. The queen died many years later, peacefully, in bed, surrounded by soft candlelight, her rosary coiled in her hand. When the court came to dress her body for the vigil, the royal wardrobe was open. They reached for the indigo morning gown, the one with embroidered lilies, reserved for final rites. But her lady chamberlain paused. Then she opened the back of the wardrobe. And there, folded beneath the lavender sachets and wrapped in soft linen, lay the woolen dress. No insignia, no pearls, only memory. And when the queen was laid in the chapel, beneath banners that fluttered in the half-light, she wore the gown she had chosen herself. The people filed past her, their footsteps muffled by ancient stone. Some cried, some crossed themselves, some whispered prayers they weren't sure she needed. But one girl, young, unnoticed, in a gown just a little too stiff for her small frame, stopped and looked longer, and saw not just a queen, but a woman, real, soft, strong, and at last, at ease. And so the torches are dimmed, the footsteps have vanished, and the heavy doors of history close once more on the life of a medieval queen. No longer a figure of ceremony or sacrifice, just a quiet name written in time. As the images and voices of the past fade into silence, a hush remains, a soft reminder that even in grandeur, even in golden halls and sacred vows, the deepest longing was often for warmth, for freedom, for peace. And now, there are no more stories to follow tonight, only the hush of history and your own peaceful breath. Let the world fade away. May you find calm, and may your dreams be gentle and deep.